out. Everybody.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm your host, Josh, and I'm joined in the studio by my favorite guys on this planet Earth. We got my main man, Austin.
Hey, man. Wow, I'm honored you said that.
That's right. You guys mean the world to me.
Hey.
Thanks for holding it down while I was gone.
Oh, yeah. How was the vacay?
Clearly good. I got a nice tan. If you're watching this, I got a little sun-kissed. And I just got to unplug for a week. It was amazing. Literally didn't think about anything.
Good.
I was like a zombie on the beach. Some people were concerned about me because I just didn't move.
Just sitting there, just staring
into the waves,
ocean.
man.
Yeah.
There's nothing more therapeutic than just staring into the ocean abyss.
It's a beautiful thing.
It is. It does wonders for the mind. But we're also joined by Danny, our producer. How's it going, man?
It's going good, and I'm also flattered too.
Well, you're welcome, guys. We've got a very special episode for you today. Could be our longest one yet, in all the best ways, because we're covering an individual who really had a major impact on history and on what it means to be a serial killer.
One of the most unique serial killers, not to make like a big old blanket statement, but really, in my opinion, maybe one of the most interesting. And the reason it's one of the longest is probably because, I don't know, you can't speed run this guy.
No, there's no speed running allowed.
I would just do an injustice to everything that happened and all the victims that are at play here. So yeah, it's a big one.
I think it's rare to see a serial killer operate undetected for as long as this man did.
Yeah, it reminds me, I think maybe BTK held out for, a few decades, but yeah, Ted is up there.
Ted is up there. Yes, we're going to be talking about the Unabomber, really the definition of an evil genius. I mean, this man, his intelligence, especially academically, was on a whole other playing field.
Yeah, U of M, Harvard, the big dogs.
PhD in mathematics.
Yeah.
Interesting. My father has not a PhD in mathematics, but he went to school for mathematics. And I remember asking him just how hard like college level mathematics are. So I can only imagine how hard getting your PhD in mathematics
I could never
would be.
Yeah.
Here's a fun fact about Ted Kaczynski though. So Ted, when he went to get his PhD, his dissertation was on some type of equation that had never been solved before. And he actually solved this unsolvable equation and published it. And he was extremely young when he did this as well, which we'll get into here in a little bit. But the guy was, especially mathematically, just on a whole other level. Like, I hate to compare him to like Albert Einstein level, but he's definitely up there. And so it really makes you wonder, like, for a guy that's so smart, why do you have to pick such a destructive path?
Yeah.
And I think that's the big mystery here, and such a philosophical individual as well.
Yeah.
A lot of deep thoughts and opinions on society and technology. And we're going to get into all of it. We're going to go all the way back to the very beginning. We're going to take you through every single one of his crimes and try to figure out what happened to Ted. Because I think even to this day, there's a lot of people that are very, have differing opinions on Ted. And especially when it comes to his manifesto and a lot of the things that he said and a lot of predictions that he made about modern civilization and technology and society. I think there's a lot of accuracies there with kind of how things have played out since Ted's been gone. And so, yeah, it's a wild one.
He's still talked about to this day. I mean, even since he's passed, I remember when he passed, even people were talking about his manifestos and stuff. And I think it's tough. It's one of those separate the art from the artist type deals where maybe it's the right message, wrong messenger. But yeah, a lot of theories about how he turned out this way. And even regardless of Ted Kaczynski, the man, I guess some people do, I don't know, think they can separate his writings from the horrific things he did.
Well, it's like I was just thinking the other day, I was on vacation. I was at some local place there and they were playing Michael Jackson.
Yeah.
I'm like,
yeah.
we're still playing Michael Jackson music?
The king of pop.
It's like, it's kind of a similar situation where do you separate the art from the artist?
Yeah.
Or is it all tarnished because of what he did personally?
I mean, I might get flack for this. I still watch Roman Polanski movies. I still watch Woody Allen movies. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, okay? They entertain me, but I realize that the people who created those movies are highly problematic people. So, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tricky one to navigate, and I'm sure a lot of people have a lot of feelings about that, which we want to hear,
Yeah.
of course. But let's go ahead and just start at the very beginning with Mr. Ted Kaczynski, and we'll take you all the way through this wild journey. So Ted Kaczynski was born Theodore John Kaczynski, and he was born on May 22nd, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He was the oldest son of Wanda and Theodore R. Kaczynski, and he had one younger brother named David. The entirety of Ted's early childhood was spent in the Chicago area, where his father worked as a sausage maker for many years, along with working other blue-collar jobs. Wanda was a homemaker and took great care of the children. The Kaczynski family was a typical middle-class one, and the kids were well cared for, but there wasn't a lot of money left over to buy extravagant things or go on grandiose vacations. Instead, the family would often visit parks and lakes for camping trips, which sparked a love for nature in Ted. Similar kind of to my upbringing. I never went on vacation with my family ever. It was only camping.
Really?
True fact.
Like you never
No cap.
left the state?
Nope.
Wow.
It was only Colorado camping trips. I did go to New Mexico once. But yeah, my parents they were both school teachers, so didn't make a lot of money. And they love the outdoors, they love camping, and so that's all we did. I've never, to this day, never been on a plane with my family ever.
Oh, wow.
To this day, yeah. Yeah. Well, minus I did go on one with my mom when I went on a plane for the first time at 18 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. So I like Ted's upbringing and especially his love for nature. I definitely identify with that a lot because that was me. I grew up in nature and camping. And so I think especially early on in life, even though as a kid, you're like, oh, this is boring and there's nothing to do, but it does something to you. It definitely, I think, kind of fosters that inner want and need to just be out in nature, especially as an adult now. Like I love being out in nature and
Same.
try to get out as much as I possibly can.
Yeah.
So I totally get that.
Yeah, as a scout, we went camping almost every month. So same here.
The household also had a great focus on education, and the boys were praised for doing very well academically. Ted never had an issue on this front as he excelled in school. Ted attended Park Community High School in the suburb of Evergreen Park, Illinois. During his time there, a counselor became aware of his educational gifts and pushed for the boy to move to a higher grade. It is reported that Ted skipped 2 grades, though some reports say he only skipped a single grade. I think I had heard he had skipped like 5th grade to 7th grade or something like that.
I would never do this to my kid if I had a kid. Socially, I think it would just mess him up. We have we make such core friends when we're growing up and we're that young. Man, if my parents just all of a sudden I was in 7th grade and I just had to say goodbye to my friends and go with the older kids, that would suck. That would feel so isolating.
Well, just think about how much of a difference there is between like an 11-year-old and a 13-year-old.
Yeah.
Or
huge.
a 13 and a 15-year-old. I mean, the development as a child is so rapid that even 2 years is just a massive leap.
Yeah.
Physically and mentally.
Yeah, I remember like when I was like a freshman in high school, I thought the seniors were grown ass adults.
Oh, yeah.
They had, like their beards were coming in. They were like massive. I was like, holy shit.
Who are these grown ass men? Yeah. So imagine, it's tough because it's like you want the best for your kid. You want to give them the best education, but it's like, why speed that up so much, especially so early?
Yeah.
Right? Like, just to be left behind socially. And I think that's kind of a issue with our education system, that there's not as much of a focus on socially developing people and how important those social skills are early on in childhood development. And, some places or some parents are so focused on the academics that they forget when you get into the real world, you got to have a little bit of both, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't just be super academically smart and gifted, but yet you have no social skills. Most jobs require that you socialize with your coworkers or work in teams. And so you're at a disadvantage, even if you are brilliant. Obviously there's jobs that will, you don't need to work with anybody, or you can be brilliant and do just fine, but society's not like that too. It's like, it's not all about work too.
You have to interact with people.
Yeah. You interact with people everywhere you go as an adult. So to not build those social skills at an early age is definitely doing Ted a major disservice. And this really became a point of contention for Ted, as the older boys in his class never seemed to accept him. Later, he would blame his counselor's decision for setting him on a dark path and ruining his social life, but Ted's social interactions later in life might suggest he was already socially stunted before that point. Regardless, Ted was so intelligent that he graduated high school in 1958 at the age of 16. Get this, with an IQ of 167. To put that into perspective, to be considered a genius on the IQ scale, it's 140.
Yeah.
So 167. Wow. I mean, I've heard some things about the IQ test and stuff.
I've heard as well.
Not necessarily accurate,
but I mean, that's still incredible.
But to blow past 140 and be at 167, that definitely says a lot about his intelligence.
And at 16 years old too.
That's nuts.
Yeah.
I wonder what my IQ was at 16.
Mine was like negative 40.
I probably couldn't even spell IQ. It was like, what? I was more interested in what the girl sitting in front of me thought of me than I was about an IQ test at 16, or like when I was going to get my driver's license.
Yeah, that was it.
I'm like, school, whatever. I just need to be able to go pick up my girlfriend.
Seriously.
Well, not Ted. Ted was accepted into Harvard University. So not just like the local community college or the state college. We're talking Harvard. On a full scholarship.
16.
That's nuts.
That's so much weight to put on a kid too.
Who's ready for college at 16?
I wasn't even ready for college at 18, man. That was too much.
I think a lot of people would argue you're not ready for college until you're like 20.
Right.
You need some time to develop before you go to college and focus on the academics of college. And I was just seeing like what the graduation rate for college is right now. It's like 60% at most colleges or something. It's like 40% drop out of college for various reasons. Obviously not all because of they don't do well academically. Money's a big issue.
Yeah, money.
College these days is a little bit different.
That's why I went to community college. I had a great experience at community college, and then I felt like I was finally ready to dig in.
Yeah.
Once I went to my university, and I actually gave a shit about my classes by then. And I was like 20 by then. So you're right.
So by the time you enter university, you're much, got a little bit more experience under your belt and just mature. It gives you time to mature a bit. Yeah. I went to a community college as well. I highly recommend, if anybody out there is thinking about going to college, save some money, first of all, but you get just as good of an education at most community colleges than you do at a university. Yeah. Honestly, my experience at community college was far better than what I got when I did do a semester at, freshman and sophomore year of college.
Yeah.
I felt like the professors the class sizes were much smaller, first of all, but it was just a better experience.
Yeah. And all my credits transferred.
Yeah. So that's a beautiful thing. And your wallet thanks you later.
Yeah, seriously.
Or your parents' wallet thanks you later, It's expensive. This episode is brought to you by my friends over at Fume. If you've ever tried to break a bad habit and felt like you're climbing Mount Everest in some flip-flops, yeah, we've all been there at some point. But here's a breath of fresh air. Fume. It's not about giving up, it's about switching it up. Fume takes your habit and simply makes it better, healthier, and a whole lot more enjoyable. Fume, if you've never heard of it before, is an innovative, award-winning, flavored air device that does just that. Instead of vapor, Fume uses the air all around us, just flavorizes it in delicious, mouth-watering flavors in crisp mint, white cranberry, maple pepper. It is utterly delicious, and the device is next level technology. So if you're looking to break a bad habit that you have, Fume is the answer. It comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting. It's very fun to play with, giving your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your habit. So start your year off right with the good habit by going to tryfume.com/lightsout and getting the Journey Pack today. Fume is giving listeners of the show 10% off when they use our code LIGHTSOUT to help make starting the good habit that much easier. But Ted went on full ride scholarship to Harvard, and while he was there, he met his friend Roy Wright. Roy would later describe Ted as a great friend, but shy. He said that Ted needed to get to know people before he would open up, but was definitely not antisocial. Roy explained that his relationship with Ted wasn't superficial. They talked for hours about deep philosophical quandaries and developed a meaningful friendship. And it seemed even at the time, Ted was extremely concerned about the way technological advancement and big businesses were threatening the environment and the stability of humankind. He worried deeply about the future, what it would look like if there weren't stricter safeguards against the development of technology. Roy and Ted talked about these topics all the time, and even though Roy agreed with Ted on many of his points, Ted felt far stronger about the subject than anyone else he knew. Still, he loved Ted's passion, and it only increased their bond. After some time, Ted withdrew from everyone around him. Roy said that it came to a point that he would sit with Ted in the dining hall, and Ted would hurry and gulp down his food, get up and leave without saying a word to anyone. Which this obviously kind of hurt Roy a little bit, and he realized that his friendship must be over and never understood until decades later why his friend had changed overnight. Ted graduated from Harvard with a mathematics degree in 1962 at the age of 20. After he graduated from Harvard, Ted enrolled at the University of Michigan, where he earned a master's and a PhD in mathematics in 1964 and 1967. With his doctoral studies completed, Ted accepted a role as an assistant professor of mathematics at the University of California, Berkeley. Ted was only 25 years old when he began his career as a professor, but the lifestyle seemed dissatisfying to Ted, because I'm like, you do have to interact with people as a professor. So I'm sure that was extremely uncomfortable for Ted. Although getting to teach, what he was passionate about, mathematics and stuff, probably helped a little bit, I would assume.
Yeah. My classes, the best ones were where I could actually connect with a professor on a more personal level. Feel like it's just more engaging that way.
Absolutely.
But I guess mathematics is maybe, I don't want to generalize, but I could see how a mathematics course would be, you could just completely disconnect from the professor and just do the math equations.
Well, when you think about the mathematics at that level too, like one problem could take hours to solve. So I'm sure there's a lot of silence of just like scribbling on a chalkboard and stuff. So I don't know how much socializing there's going on in a math, PhD or master's program.
That's a good point.
But Ted saved his money for 2 years before abruptly resigning in 1969, citing personal reasons. He was, I believe he was like the youngest professor there as well. So just probably younger than some of the kids attending school there. So that definitely puts you kind of in an awkward situation. But with his savings in hand, Ted made his way to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he lived for a few years. There really isn't that much information on Ted's time in Salt Lake City, but the FBI would later say it seemed the man stayed off the grid while working odd jobs in the city and back in the Chicago area. And after a few years, Ted made his way to Great Falls, Montana, where he began searching for a secluded place to live. And that's when he ended up finding some land on the edge of a historic 9,000-acre estate in Lincoln, Montana. Beautiful place. Ted contacted the property owner, Clifford Gearing, and according to Clifford's granddaughter, Jamie, explained that he had attempted to get a homesteading permit in Canada, but had failed. At the time, Cliff needed money and he agreed to sell the land to Ted. And on June 19, 1971, Ted and his brother David met with Cliff at a small real estate office on the outskirts of Lincoln and bought the property for $2,100. Ted became the proud owner of 1.4 secluded acres surrounded by land owned by multiple generations of the Gearing family. The closest neighbor on the property was Chris Waits, who lived a few miles down the dirt road that ran through the property. On the other side of Ted's land, around 5 miles away, was the property of Cliff's son, Butch, who ran the Gearing sawmill. Despite Ted's quiet demeanor, Chris and Butch both found the man pleasant and quickly struck up what felt like a loose friendship. The men allowed Ted to use some of their tools and supplies as he built his cabin on the land. Other times, Ted would show up at Chris or Butch's homes to help them with their own projects or just to ask what day it was, which is why that'd be wild to have somebody come and be like, hey, what day is it?
Yeah,
Like, where are you living, bro? Like, you don't have a clock. You don't like keep track of the day.
It's like someone who just time traveled. They're like, what day and year is it?
Yeah.
And then they just disappear into the forest after you tell them.
But this wasn't all that alarming to them. You know, Ted was odd. I think they're just like, he just wants to be a hermit. Seems harmless, but definitely a little cuckoo. But he had even made friends in town with the local librarian, Sherry Wood, who would suggest books he might find interesting. By the end of the first year in Lincoln, Ted had completed his 10-foot by 14-foot cabin, which is not,
that's small.
What's this room? It's like this room, or maybe smaller than this room. Real small.
Oh, God.
Yeah, this is
Kinda
probably
crazy,
bigger than
yeah,
that, I think.
yeah.
I think this is probably like 12 by 16.
I would lose my mind if I lived in like a one-room cabin. I couldn't do it.
Permanently?
Yeah.
It's like tiny house living.
Yeah, I could. Where would my records go?
Outside.
Yeah.
You'd have to like hang them from the ceiling.
Yeah.
Just on string or something. At this point in time, Ted was still in contact with his brother David, and his brother David was resting easy knowing that his brother was getting to fulfill his dream of living peacefully off the land out in nature. Ted's life goals were far more sinister than anyone around him could have anticipated, though. I mean, I can only imagine being isolated in a cabin. You know, you'd have your good moments where you're like, this is great.
Yeah.
It's peaceful. But then I'm sure you get trapped in the mind. You know,
we tend to romanticize this idea of like self-isolation, I think, a lot. It's like, I could go off in a cabin somewhere and write a book and be by myself. But really, I mean, if anyone actually thinks that, I suggest you just go and try that for a little bit. It's not fun after like a week. It gets old. You're like, I need some human connection. We're built to connect with each other. It doesn't even matter if it's just a conversation with the clerk at the gas station, right? It's like,
which I guess Ted is still doing that to some extent.
Yeah, because he's going to the neighbors and he's doing this, but
so he's getting that, but still,
yeah,
I'm like, there's had to have
it's
been
not healthy
times where he's like starts spiraling.
Yeah, we're not meant to live like this as much as it's romanticized, I think, especially nowadays. I always see those like videos of like, look, you could be isolated in this beautiful cabin.
Yeah.
You don't need anybody and you just hang out here. And I'm just like, I don't think that would be fun after a while. I think that get old real
especially
quick.
with no running water, no electricity. Does that sound inviting?
No, absolutely not. I'm
so
good.
Roughing it.
Yeah. And we both like camping.
Yeah.
But
I don't mind doing it for a few days.
We go home after it, right?
Well, there gets to be a point where you're like, all right, this was fun. I'm ready for a shower.
Yeah.
I'm ready for my bed.
Yeah.
And I need to charge my phone. Yeah.
I know Ted would hate that we're talking about like, I need to go back to technology. Yeah.
Technology, man.
But that was his point, is like just disconnecting permanently,
Yeah, this dude doesn't even have a car. He's just
Yeah.
riding his bike around.
Yep. So the late 70s, this was a tumultuous time for Ted, and he had been living off the grid for several years, but would, from time to time leave his home to work and save up some money. This was how he managed to support his quote unquote hermit lifestyle. He never needed to make much, but just enough to ensure he was fed and that he had supplies he needed for his hobbies. And at that point, Ted was in his mid-30s, was still socially stunted in many ways, as we've said before. Particularly, he had a challenging time sparking the romantic interests of the women around him. And this would be a problem that permeate his whole life. Though some women in his life thought he was nice enough, he had this unwashed lifestyle of a recluse, and it wasn't really exactly what many women are looking for. I mean, basic hygiene is typically kind of a standard in the dating world, right? Other women, those who were married or dating his friends, thought Ted had no respect for women, and he sometimes vocalized that he thought they were useless.
Which the two of those things together, definitely not going to get any girls.
Nope. So in 1978, he returned to Chicago to stay with his family and work at Foam Cutting Engineers, which was a factory where his father and brother David were both employed. At the time, David was in a supervisory role, and his father helped him get the position. At first, there were no significant issues. Ted, he was a hard worker, he earned his money, he went home. But something unexpected happened later that year, and Ted, he became attracted to a 30-year-old female superior. Her name was Ellen Tarmichael. She worked at the factory, and he asked her out on a date. She agreed. David would later recall how after they went out one evening, Ted returned home and burst into David's room. He was so excited. He exclaimed, quote, "She kissed me." But things didn't last. After a couple dates, Ellen let Ted know that she just didn't really feel a romantic spark for him, but she still wanted to be friends, just not his lover. So Ted, obviously, he struggles with women, so he took this news poorly.
And like a child.
Yes, absolutely like a child. So according to his brother David, Ted began writing filthy limericks about Ellen and posting them on the walls and doors of the factory. Complete and utter immaturity here. This is a
30-some-year-old man.
Yeah, acting like a 14-year-old, basically. So here's one of the limericks that he posted around work. There's a certain young lady named Ellen, whose fanny is very repelling, for the overgrown mass of fat on her ass makes a gross, disproportionate swelling. Her girdle's a tight one, of course. It's nylon and steel reinforced, but no matter how hard she squeezes her lard, she still has an ass like a horse.
Sounds like a beautiful, curvy woman.
Yeah, honestly.
Slay
yeah.
queen. Ellen was a...
Seriously. We like them thick here on Lights Out.
Absolutely. Love it. So too much woman for Ted to handle, clearly. So
absolutely. And Ted, man, for a guy with like 167 IQ.
Yeah, pretty shitty limerick.
Weak limerick, immature, lame.
Why does he sound like he's in the 1800s too? Like his vocabulary here is like, I felt like I was reading something from like 1905 or something.
But obviously this didn't go over well, and David, his brother, he pulled Ted aside and he gave him a warning, knock it off or I'm going to have to fire you. The next day, Ted posted another limerick on the wall and asked David, "So are you going to fire me?" And
fuck yeah, dude.
Right. David was like, "Yes, I guess. Just because I'm your brother doesn't mean you can get away with this shit." So later it became clear through Ted's personal journals that he was actually way more upset about the breakup than even David knew or anybody else at the time. In fact, Ted said he couldn't stop thinking about the woman, and the only way he could get her face out of his head was to mutilate it. He planned to carry out his attack that following Saturday, but according to his journal, things just didn't work out and he never went through with it. Very concerning that this is how he's handling rejection.
Very immature.
Yeah. And this is a part of what he wrote. Quote, "Last Thursday morning, I drove to the plant and parked in the lot, waiting for Ellen. When she arrived, I ran over to her car, said I wanted to speak to her briefly, and told her to move over so I could get out of the rain. This she did slowly and grudgingly, and I got into the driver's seat. I carried with me a knife concealed in a paper bag."
Which, how is that her fault? Unintentionally humiliated me.
Yeah, right?
You probably humiliated yourself, dude.
Yeah, he's being a big baby. This is him continuing this journal entry. Quote, "In the brief discussion that followed, she said that the reason she had been so cold on Sunday was that it, quote, just struck her at the beginning of the day that there was nothing between us, no future in anything between us because we had nothing in common."
She's probably like technology.
Yeah, God forbid. Also, completely fair. It's like we just don't have anything in common. There's no romantic
That's okay,
spark.
Ted.
Move
People
on.
are allowed to not have something in common with you. Because I'm sure in his mind, he's like, oh, my wife, he's like fantasizing about what this woman's going to be to him. And just because he has no experience. I mean, you remember early on, when your relationships, you just have this unrealistic view of the person.
Yep.
I mean, I would listen to Lifehouse, you and me in the back of the car, fantasizing about this girl who was like a year older than me that I thought I was going to get married and have babies with.
Right.
And
Yeah.
dude, so off, man.
Yeah.
Like, it just shows you like
it's a very immature mindset, but it's very problematic when it's now a 30-some-year-old and who is resorting to like violent fantasies to deal with this. So it's like, we all kind of have this early on where we're just like, I'm going to marry this woman one day, you know? That kind of goes through everybody's mind. Young love.
It's a Bruno Mars
like
song.
That. Is it?
Yeah, I think it is. I don't know why. That just reminded me of that.
I mean, it's totally normal, but this is now not normal.
No.
This is not how you deal with things.
Well, he's pissed. He's angry. And it's interesting how rather than dealing with that anger in a normal way, he's like, no, I'll just mutilate her. So that'll solve it.
Yeah, that'll do it here.
Like, what?
And he continued on and he said, quote, she also said that the first 2 times she went out with me, she did so because she, quote, really thought there might be something in it, friendship or ... Totally fair. Yeah, she's like, I thought that's why you date, Ted.
It's a first date,
yeah,
bro. Like,
this is how this goes,
it's not
brother.
your wedding. Like, what do you think this is?
Yeah. He then said, quote, I had then and still have grave doubts about the truth of this last statement because she has often seemed insincere in the past and because that statement is contradicted by things she said earlier. Good God. So problematic. That is so problematic to say. She's trying to be honest with you and you're just saying, no, this seems insincere because she's been insincere in the past. It's not really the truth, what she's telling me, because he just can't take a rejection.
He's trying to compute the math here and it's not computing.
Yep. So he continues, quote, nevertheless, the statement cooled my anger because if true, it would mean she was not just using me as a toy. So that was the end of that. Okay, so at least thank God, at least he realized it was the end, but he was still going to take a knife to her face. But just like that, Ted, who had gone to the parking lot to brutally attack that woman, simply decided not to. And he said he cooled off, but many experts actually believe he may have realized he never would have gotten away with the crime, and that's the only reason he didn't do it, because obviously it's like he posted the limericks, the whole office knows that he was obsessed with
very obvious
Ellen
who attacked her.
Exactly. And, you know, whatever credit this is, Ted was still, he's a smart guy, right? So he knows the repercussions here. Meanwhile, while he was staying in Chicago, something else was happening about 15 miles away in Evanston, Illinois. At Northwestern University, a package had been left in the parking lot. And here we go. According to investigators, it appeared that the parcel was too large to fit into the mailbox at the university. So the package had been readdressed to appear as though a professor on the campus had been attempting to send the parcel instead of the parcel being addressed to that professor. A little bit confusing, but someone found the parcel in the parking lot, saw the return address, and walked it into the university and back to the supposed sender, who was Professor of Engineering Buckley Christ. Professor Christ alerted security, informing them that he had not sent that package. As security opened the package, the bomb partially detonated and caused minor injuries to the man's hand. The FBI was then called to investigate, but the, quote, signature of the bomb did not match any known bombers or criminals in the area. What they could determine was that the bomb was not created by a professional. They called it clumsy and crude, and I agree, because the detonating system was made of cut-off match heads, which, you know, they ignite. If you ever see like those slow-mos of how match heads ignite, if you have a bunch of them in one location, they can really spread. And the propellant was loosely packed black powder. So he's just like matches and black powder. This is like the most elementary. For a guy with 167 IQ,
to be fair, he had never built bombs before.
True.
So this was a learning experience. But you would think that he would do a little bit more
I guess that
research
at Harvard, there was no bomb making 101 class he could take. So he's just trying to throw this shit together.
Well, I think he had to literally teach himself chemistry too, which I'm sure he took chemistry throughout his studies to some extent, but obviously a little bit different kind of chemistry when you're trying to accomplish
for sure
detonation. So
But in the end, there was no way to determine who actually left the bomb.
Almost exactly 1 year after the first bomb on May 9th, 1979 at Northwestern University, the bomber struck again. This time the bomb was built into a standard-sized cigar box and left sitting on an empty table in a second-floor room of the Institute. Eventually, a graduate student, 35-year-old John G. Harris, found the box and opened it, at which time the bomb detonated. He was transported to a local hospital with burn and shrapnel injuries to his body, but was released an hour later. The bomb was just as crude as the first one, but was crafted with different materials, including batteries, wires, scraps of paper, and smokeless powder, which can be found in shotgun shells. It became clear that the person behind the bombs was experimenting and trying to improve his technique, which seriously concerned investigators that they're seeing, okay, this next bomb's a little bit better than the last one, so that probably means there's going to be more coming. Later, investigators would discover that Ted kept detailed journals about his crimes. After reading in the newspaper that the graduate student was okay, he wrote, quote, "Unfortunately, I didn't notice anything in the article indicating that he would suffer any permanent disability. I figured the bomb was probably not powerful enough to kill, but I had hoped that the victim would be blinded, or have his hands blown off, or be otherwise maimed. Well, at least I put him in the hospital, which is better than nothing."
Man.
This is fucking evil, man.
Yeah.
After this entry in the journal, Ted goes on to describe other crimes he had committed while living in Lincoln, from killing a rancher's cow to smashing mailboxes and vandalizing vehicles and cabins. Which sounds like a bunch of juvenile delinquents.
Bullshit, yeah.
He then laid out his true feelings plain as day. He said, quote, "As a result of indoctrination since childhood, I had strong inhibitions against doing these things. I think that perhaps I could now kill someone under circumstances where there was very little chance of getting caught, but I'm not sure I could because often one's brainwashing turns out to be stronger than one thought. As for motivation, I hate the technological society because it deprives me of personal autonomy. It may be in some sense inevitable, but it is so only because of the way people behave. People I hate most are those who consciously and willfully promote the technological society, such as scientists, businessmen, and politicians. I emphasize that my motivation is personal revenge." Says it all.
Yeah, you got it right there.
Yeah.
And we can dive into this a little bit later, but I think he's scapegoating the technology a little bit here. I mean, we know his problems with women, his isolation, his lack of social skills, his lack of love, really. At the end of the day,
lack of love is
yeah.
the real culprit here for Ted.
So I think he's finding a scapegoat maybe to work his rage into, and this is what he's found, I guess. But in the later months of 1979, Ted switched up his MO and decided he was going to detonate a bomb on an airliner. According to his journals, this bomb was far more expensive to build. He loaded it up with extra explosive material and rigged it to be triggered by an altimeter, which, if you don't know, this measures the altitude of an object. Pretty basic. He also constructed it from a standard barometer, which measures atmospheric pressure. So he's getting more complex here and bigger targets. Some say, if he's accounting for variations in atmospheric pressure, stuff like this is kind of a testament to how intelligent this bomb creator really is, and that would show up to investigators later. He thought he had created a device strong enough to end multiple lives. He mailed this package by priority mail on October 28th to ensure it would travel by air. On November 15th, 1979, the bomb was loaded into the cargo bay on American Airlines Flight 444. As the plane reached the specific altitude set on the trigger, the bomb detonated. 80 passengers were on board, but the bomb created minimal damage and the plane ended up landing safely after the explosion. Screw you, Ted. There were 0 injuries, and investigators referred to the bomb as, quote, low power, which this would piss off Ted when he would read about it later. In his journal, he wrote, quote, "Unfortunately, plane not destroyed, bomb too weak. Newspaper said was, quote, low power device. Surprised me." He went on to discuss in detail where he thought he made his mistake and in what ways he could improve upon his math and design. He then continued, quote, "The paper said the FBI are investigating the incident." Despite the lack of major damage, the FBI was increasingly concerned, for good reason. This guy is now targeting airlines. This bomb was sophisticated. It had the potential to cause a mass casualty event. If Ted's calculations had been just a little bit slightly more precise, this could have taken down
huge.
An airplane. That's crazy to think about. And it was now clear this country was dealing with a serial bomber on a pretty massive scale. The media initially coined him, quote, the junkyard bomber, which I found fascinating, since his devices seemed like they were put together with scavenged pieces of scrapyard junk, which was true. He was going around Lincoln and just picking up scrap metal and stuff, so it couldn't be traced. There was no receipt from like a hardware store or something he was buying for. This was all according to plan. Ted would assemble pieces of his bombs with scrap so they couldn't be traced. With the junk metal, this was wild to me. He also assembled illegal firearms. He put together his own .22 caliber pistol that took him a year and a half to assemble. Frightening.
Yeah.
Now we have 3D printed firearms, but this guy was putting weapons together with like metal barrels and wood.
Yeah, there's a picture of it if you're watching. It's pretty interesting to look at. Very crude looking.
Yeah.
But, I mean, definitely took some time, right?
A year and a half. Wow. So they ended up, Junkyard Bomber was great, but they ended up later naming him the Unabomber. And his case name was called Unabom, UNABOM, the University of Airline Bombing Targets. So the Unabomber name would stick throughout the decades.
But by the 1980s, Ted was hurting for money to build his bombs, so he began scamming his own parents. The elderly couple was doing well financially, but was not rich. Still, they would occasionally send money to their sons as gifts, which made Ted think they could support his operation. He'd actually call his mother, whom he had otherwise cut out of his life, and tell her that he was suffering from chest pains or other ailments and needed emergency medical care, but couldn't afford it. His mother wouldn't hesitate to send her oldest son the money he requested, which he would use to buy materials to create his bombs. At this point, Ted had also begun to utilize local reference libraries to find his list of future victims. His list was long, and according to his journals, as soon as the weather improved, he was ready to begin trying to kill each person on his list. The FBI desperately worked to try and connect the dots that would lead back to potential suspects in the Unabomber case. Unfortunately, Ted's reclusive lifestyle and lack of consistency made it easy for him to avoid the FBI's radar, which honestly still kind of blows my mind to this day.
Yeah.
That it just couldn't find him or connect him back to these.
This is someone blowing up a plane almost,
right?
And they can't
figure it out. All they knew is that the bomber was an amateur, but intelligent, and they knew he was creating many parts of the bomb from scratch and was likely gathering the other components from a variety of places. But none of the pieces could be matched to create any real leads. And on June 10th, 1980, Ted struck again. This time it was his fourth bombing. And on this go-around, he addressed his explosive parcel to Percy Wood, an executive for U.S. Airlines living in Lake Forest, Illinois. What he did with this one is he hollowed out a book called Ice Brothers by Sloan Wilson, and the book had a letter that read, quote, "Dear Mr. Wood, I am taking the liberty of sending you under separate cover a book which I believe to have great social significance. I am sending copies of this book, Ice Brothers by Sloan Wilson, to a number of prominent people in the Chicago area because I believe this has to be truly a book for our time. A book that should be read by all who make important decisions affecting the public welfare. I realize that a man in your position does not have time to read every book that is recommended to him, so that I may have wasted time and money in sending you a copy of Mr. Wilson's work, but I feel sure that it will be worth your while to at least glance through the book. Since it is as entertaining as it is significant, perhaps you will then decide to read the entire work." But inside of this hollow book, Ted had planted another bomb, which detonated as Mr. Wood opened the book. Mr. Wood sustained burns and major injuries from the shrapnel, but luckily survived the attack. The explosion also caused over $1,000 in damage to Mr. Wood's home, which in today's money would be about $3,700. And after multiple days in the intensive care unit, Mr. Wood left the hospital. But according to his loved ones, the mental toll of the attack seemed to be worse than the physical injuries. And I can only imagine that to be true. I mean, you would question every single thing you ever receive in the mail or package from anybody.
Yeah, the paranormal. And just knowing that someone is out there trying to harm you and potentially kill you would just constantly be on your mind.
Yeah. The paranormal or the paranoia. Yeah.
Did I say paranormal?
You said paranormal, but
It's deep on the mind here because we got to do a paranormal episode soon. You know?
It must be what it is.
I've been jonesing for it. As the FBI reviewed the Unabomber case, they wondered why he chose the components he did. Like, they asked questions, why were so many of the bombs made inside wood boxes?
Maybe the bomber lives in the woods, surrounded by wood. Maybe.
That's a good guess. Did they have something to do with him targeting a man with the last name Wood?
Maybe.
Maybe, possibly. Were the stamps on the packages a message or simply the types of stamps available when he shopped for them? Yeah, I mean, I'd start looking into every little detail. I get why the scrutiny is high here. What they did know was that the locations of the bombings must have been significant, right? And the targets. And they believed the bomber may have originated in Chicago. Good guess. As Ted's heinous attacks continued, he was also causing trouble back home. When he would feel frustrated or annoyed by a person, he would attack them in these weird, sneaky ways. In one story, Ted would later tell an interviewer he was annoyed by a few young men who would drive dirt bikes near Ted's property. The young men stayed nearby in a family cabin when the weather was nice and used the dirt roads and trails as a place to ride. One day when it was rainy and Ted knew the young man wouldn't be at the cabin, he went there, cut a hole in the wall with an axe, destroyed the property, and he also defecated in the bathtub.
Because that'll show him.
Yeah. Also another real mature way to solve your problems here. Don't go over there and like ask, hey, could you guys keep it down? Maybe do it.
Ride
like,
somewhere else or try to befriend them and maybe, try to work with them. No.
Right.
Take a shit in your bathtub and cut a hole in your place.
This is how we solve problems here. Again, it goes back. You just don't know how to interact with people.
Yeah, it says a lot about his social skills and, and also like how mature really is Ted?
I think it feels like he's 10 years old.
He's like, I either solve things with math or, my young 12-year-old mindset.
Yeah.
Like it's one of the two. It's no in between there.
Yeah. It's like he has incredible book intelligence, and
street knowledge, zero.
Yeah. Emotional intelligence, zero.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, after he shit in the bathtub, local police and game wardens would later go to Ted's house and ask if he heard anyone causing trouble in the area. And he just said, nope, I don't know what you're talking about.
I wonder if they told him that there is a human poo in the bathtub. I wonder if they asked him point blank, did you shit? Do you know who would have went into their cabin and took a shit in their tub?
Yeah.
Wasn't a bear.
Give it to me straight.
Wasn't Goldilocks here.
Ted.
Yeah.
Did you shit in this tub? Come on. It wasn't Goldilocks.
I don't know. I'm just like, what? I wonder what the police and game wardens thought of Ted when they met him. They're probably like, this dude's weird.
He smells like absolute shit. Oh, well, they should have just connected the dots there. It was like, this guy smells like poop.
Where was Ted pooing?
And we got shit in the bed. That's a great question. He must have had like a latrine or something, right?
Or did he just like go over to that cabin and use their bathtub? That was the outhouse.
Just waffle stomped it down.
Like, my God, dude. Here we go. Get back
to the poop, right?
God, Jesus, just can't escape it. We're still on the poop cruise, apparently.
Get me off this cruise. I don't want to be here anymore.
This episode is also brought to you by one of my favorite apps, one that I visit on the daily. That first morning trip to the bathroom, popping open the old phone, and guess what app I'm tapping? Rocket Money, baby. I'm a huge fan of Rocket Money, as you can probably tell. I really do use this, and I pay for the premium plan because I find so much value in this app, and I highly recommend it to everybody. I even finally got Austin to download it.
I did it.
And also, if you have bills that you're like, I wish I could pay less for this bill, let Rocket Money go out there and try to negotiate a lower bill for you by up to 20% even. All you got to do is upload a picture of your bill to the Rocket Money app, and they do the rest. It's like magic. It's that cool. Rocket Money has over 5 million users, including us, and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year. That's a lot of money, people. And you just do that by using the app's features. So stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/lightsout. That's rocketmoney.com/lightsout. Please go there. Let them know we sent you. rocketmoney.com/lightsout. Go there now. Pause the video. Go there now. Thank you. So they weren't suspicious at all, though?
I don't know.
I guess
it would be hard to. It's like, how would you ever pin that down? You could run a DNA test if you really wanted to.
Yeah, they should have
right?
done that.
Yeah.
They
honestly,
messed up.
Yeah.
That was their clue right there.
Probably didn't have the resources for it. Or no, this was before DNA testing was really a thing.
Probably
so
they'll figure anything out.
Yeah. Those same officers later asked Chris Waite, which was the close neighbor, if he thought Ted could be involved in the vandalism. And he said, oh no. Quote, he's got his quirks. We all do, but he wouldn't do that. In fact, Ted got away with a lot because people in the area thought he was harmless. A little weird, but generally harmless. One person he repeatedly convinced was his friend was Butch Gehring. Ted really, in his heart of hearts, didn't like that Butch ran a sawmill, which he found loud and grating and a symbol of the type of technology he hated. So during this time, he would be going over to Butch's place, playing pinochle, going over for dinner sometimes, giving gifts, handmade gifts and stuff. But yeah, kind of behind the scenes. He was
behind
just
his back, he's
talking
like, fuck
shit.
Butch.
Yeah.
He's cutting down all the trees.
Yeah, exactly. Making too much noise and using this technology that I hate. But Ted he would speak poorly of Butch in his journals and especially in a later interview. But Butch thought of Ted as a friend at the time, and he even defended him multiple times over the years. One time, early in Butch's marriage, Ted showed up peeping in his windows at his partially dressed wife. When she ran out and confronted him, Ted was very polite. He said he was just looking for Butch, wondering what day it was. She told him, and he left. She and Butch chalked it up to just an honest mistake, which, I don't know, looking in people's windows, you could just knock on the door, man.
Was it not that he was curious about seeing a woman partially undressed?
Yeah. There you go.
Or did he really want to just know what day it was? Can't wait for better timing there.
Yeah.
Or maybe he's just that socially inept.
True.
He just doesn't know any better.
Yeah, could be both. Later, one of Butch's dogs was found poisoned. Another dog was found shot in the anus and killed, and someone had also ruined thousands of dollars worth of machinery by putting sawdust in the engines.
Damn. That's sad.
Yeah.
Poor dogs. What do they do to them?
Yeah, and I don't know if this was mentioned, but Butch also hired Ted on at his sawmill a few days just for some extra money, and this is how Ted repays him.
Why the dogs, though? Is it the dogs were just annoying and barking and felt like it disturbed the peace out there? Or
I mean, that it feels like just victims he could take out without
anger,
repercussions.
He's just trying to take it out. Why don't you go hug a tree, bro?
Yeah.
Go
reconnect with nature.
Yeah, dude, go take a hike.
About.
What are you doing?
Yeah, it seems like he didn't live by what he preached.
I kind of tend to think that he has this urge to kill.
Yeah.
That serial killer urge is there this entire time, and he's fighting to keep it at bay.
Yeah. And just the way that he didn't mutilate Ellen is he knows when he can get caught and when he can kind of get away with things.
Right.
So I think he's doing it tactically.
Mm-hmm.
So when these dogs began dying, Butch just assumed it was maybe some neighborhood teenagers that were doing this. But later, when Butch and his wife Tammy had children, Ted would show up with handmade toys for the kids. So later, Butch remarried to a woman named Wendy, and they had a child together. So at this point, they had Jamie and an infant daughter, and I know they were living at the house here. But Ted would show up sometimes with handmade toys for the kids. And later, Wendy would be out on their property playing with their toddler. And Ted was actually pointing a rifle at them, kind of guessing, should I shoot them? I could do it right here. And I guess Wendy might have caught him at some point, but he didn't say anything. And she and her daughter left the field and assumed, look, maybe Ted had just heard them, thought they were wild animals or trespassers. Granted, Ted was hunting his own game and living off the land for a bit, so maybe it was just a mistake, but his journals would later reveal that he wanted to kill both Wendy and her daughter, who he referred to as, quote, the big bitch and the little bitch, but he wasn't sure he could get away with it, so he didn't do it. So by this point, I mean, it's pretty obvious Ted Kaczynski is a menace, but somehow he had managed to pull the wool over basically everybody's eyes, all those around him, and nobody thought he was anything more than just the strange kind of hermit man who was occasionally kind.
Yeah, very strange to think about that, because I don't know. I feel like I would have been more sketched out. But again, this is rural Montana, and maybe it's just pretty normal to have just kind of oddballs living around you.
Yeah.
So
it is where you go to just isolate and live off the land if you want to.
And he is doing kind gestures, making homemade toys. I could just kind of see chalking up to, okay, he's kind of a weirdo.
Yeah.
But he's not a bad guy by any means.
He would even go over to the house and kind of help
right.
out with house projects and painting and stuff
right.
like that. So
it's quite possible when that whole incident happened, he was just like hunting rabbits or something, because I know he would hunt rabbits and eat the rabbits around on his property.
Yep.
But in 1981, Ted traveled by bus to Salt Lake City, Utah, and on October 8th, a bomb was left at the University of Utah and found by a maintenance worker. Before it could detonate, it was defused, giving the FBI far more evidence than they had from the previous explosions. They found that the bomb was essentially a gas can with a small pipe bomb inside. They believed the bomber's thought process was the pipe bomb would detonate and the gas would cause a large flash explosion. In 1982, while in Utah, Ted sent a bomb to Patrick Fisher of Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. The package arrived on May 5th, 1982, but wasn't opened by Fisher. Instead, it was opened by his assistant, Janet Smith. Janet was seriously injured in the explosion, but Fisher was unharmed. This bomb utilized a slightly altered design in that the pipe used was a metal P-trap pipe, which is a curved piece of pipe you often see when looking under the sink.
And most pipe bombs you just see are the straight pipes.
It was a small change, but it showed that the bomber was still experimenting with his designs, which meant they might continue to grow more and more powerful until someone was killed. The FBI also recognized that the bomber seemed to be targeting mostly scientists, though that wasn't consistent among all of his victims. Also, Ted was aware of forensic science and never left any fingerprints or DNA evidence behind. On July 2nd, a package was left in the break room of Corey Hall at the University of California, Berkeley. An engineering professor by the name Diogenes Angelikos found the bomb, which then exploded in his hand, degloving his fingers. Luckily, the doctors were able to reattach and graft his flesh and repair the damaged hand. Ted then wrote in his journal, quote, "I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and I placed in computer science building a bomb consisting of a pipe bomb and a gallon can of gasoline. According to newspapers, the vice chairman of the computer science department picked it up. He was considered to be out of danger of losing any fingers, but would need further surgery for bone and tendon damage in hand. Apparently, pipe bomb went off but did not ignite gasoline. I don't understand it. Frustrated. Traveling expenses for raids such as the foregoing are very hard on my slender financial resources." The UC Berkeley bomb then offered an interesting piece of information to the FBI, because there was a typewritten note that simply said, "Woo, W-U. It works. I told you it would. R.V." The FBI believed they might have had a clue and began asking the public if they knew of anyone named Wu who may know someone with the initials R.V., but this turned up 0 leads, because it was a red herring. Then the bombings suddenly stopped. At first, everyone expected another bomb to show up somewhere at any time, but as the weeks turned into months and then years, people began to wonder what had happened to the Unabomber. Did the Unabomber end up in jail for some other crime? Did he blow himself up somewhere so the world could rest easy? Was he finally so frustrated at his inability to kill that he just gave up? Nobody knew but Ted.
Man, that would have been best case if he just accidentally blew himself up and really solved the issue here. So when Ted returned to his home in Montana after bombing at UC Berkeley, he found something that disturbed him. On the other side of the divide near his property, he heard TNT explosions going off, and when he checked it out, he found a mining operation in the area. In his journal, Ted wrote that he believed Exxon was mining the area looking for oil, which would be devastating. He attempted to stop them by shooting down their scouting helicopters. He would just aim his rifle up into the air and start, pulling off rounds and shooting at helicopters. Obviously, this was unsuccessful, and instead, Ted shifted his focus and used the loud noises from the mining operation to cover up some loud noises of his own, a new explosive mix that he was experimenting with. Over the years, Ted had acquired dozens of chemistry books and had taught himself new chemical concoctions to create deadlier explosive devices. This new chemical mixture was comprised of ammonium nitrate and aluminum powder, which is far more explosive and powerful than the smokeless powder match head gas combination he had previously been using. He would also add more pieces of loose metal inside of the bombs to increase the amount of lethal shrapnel inside. So that's just evil. He's trying to hurt and kill people.
Yeah, ammonium nitrate is used in a lot of other bombs and bombing attacks, specifically Timothy McVeigh.
Oh, really?
I know he got a ton of ammonium nitrate for the bombs that he built in the back of that moving truck.
Damn.
Which I think the ATF and stuff tracks all this purchases and stuff. So I'm wondering where he got that. Maybe it wasn't tracked at this point in time, but I know now.
Maybe he made them start tracking it after this.
Yeah, it could be.
But by 1985, Ted was ready to try out his new techniques in the real world. So when Ted began his mission again, he really did come back with a vengeance. He had been gone for 2 years. There were no bombings, and the country was starting to get this idea that, you know what, maybe the Unabomber's finally gone. But on May 15th, 1985, he struck again at the University of California, Berkeley, in the exact same hall as before. This time, his bomb injured a 26-year-old engineering student named John Hauser. The young man found a mysterious plastic box sitting on a table in the university computer lab. He would later say that he unlatched it out of sheer curiosity, and this would be something that he would regret. Hauser was an Air Force pilot working toward his master's in electrical engineering, and the explosion mangled his hand, destroyed part of his arm, and left him blind in one eye. This would unfortunately and sadly end his career in the Air Force, and this was disgustingly a fact that Ted would take pleasure in. The explosion had been so powerful that the Air Force Academy ring was blown off John's hand and hit the wall, leaving a nearly perfect imprint of the insignia behind. Ted would later note that he only put 2 ounces of his explosive mixture in the bomb that mangled John Hauser. Later bombs would include more than double that amount. On June 13th, which was less than a month after John Hauser's injuries, another bomb was sent to the Boeing Fabrication Division in Washington. Luckily, the bomb was safely detonated before anyone could be injured. Unfortunately, all forensic evidence was lost in the process. That's kind of the double-edged sword of detonating a bomb, I guess. On November 15th of the same year, Ted sent a package to University of Michigan psychology professor James McConnell's home in Ann Arbor. It's not far from where I grew up. There, McConnell and one of his assistants, Nicholas Sweeney, were completing some work. The bomb was mailed from Salt Lake City, Utah, just like the bomb that was sent to Patrick Fisher. Nicholas found and opened the package for the professor. Inside was the 3-ring binder. Opening the binder triggered the bomb to detonate, injuring Sweeney and McConnell. Sweeney had to be taken to the hospital, but was said to be in fair condition. He would later tell the police that he remembered the sensation of the package expanding in his hands as it prepared to explode. McConnell seemed to be a strange victim for the Unabomber. Previously, it seemed the man was attacking big business owners and those involved in genetic science or engineering of some sort, but McConnell was a professor of psychology, so it didn't really seem to match up with the MO of the Unabomber.
What they couldn't have known at the time was that the Unabomber did have a connection with the University of Michigan. Ted Kaczynski had completed his postgraduate studies at the university, and while there, he began writing in his journal about having dark dreams. And in these dreams, he saw a psychologist. He wrote that the psychologist was trying to convince him he was sick, or trying to control his mind through psychological techniques. This, he said, angered him until he finally broke out in violence and killed the psychologist, an act that left him feeling an intense sense of relief and liberation. It was during this time that Ted also wrote about his struggles with women. He wrote about one girl in particular who he really liked and who seemed available, but he became physically ill trying to get up the nerve to call her. He didn't call and wrote in his journal, quote, "I said to myself, what am I doing here? Trying to phone some stupid broad? I don't need any damn women." It was at that time that Ted began to write about having erotomaniac fantasies about being a woman. Developmental psychologist Sasha Reed would later discuss these fantasies and explain that Ted didn't suffer from gender dysphoria. Instead, he fantasized about being a woman because he couldn't find a way to have a relationship with a woman. This led him to decide that he wanted, in his words, a sex change, which obviously is not the proper way to refer to this anymore, but this is the way that Ted wrote about it. He made an appointment to see the University of Michigan psychologist about this idea, but at the last minute, he decided he couldn't go through with it. He later thought that dying would be a better fate than going through with, as he said, sex change. It is believed that this period of his life may be the reason McConnell was targeted, though it isn't known if he was one of the psychologists Ted interacted with at the university. According to Ted's journal, this period of distress led him to decide, quote, "Why not really kill that psychologist and everyone else whom I hate?" On December 11th, the final bomb of 1985 would detonate in Sacramento, California. This time, Ted would finally succeed in his ultimate goal, which was to kill a human being, and the victim was 38-year-old Hugh Scruton. This bomb was left in the parking lot near a garbage bin at the back of Rentec Computer Rentals, a shop owned by Scruton. Scruton found the bag and picked it up, likely thinking it was garbage intended for the dumpster. It immediately exploded, sending shrapnel over 150 feet away from the building and blasting large holes in the exterior wall of the building. Hugh Scruton was killed instantly, leaving behind friends, family, and a devoted girlfriend who all described him as a kind man. They say he embraced life, was gentle with a sense of humor, and the kind of person who always took a kind and fair approach to business, and he was a true loss to the world. In Ted's journal, he didn't bother to learn anything about his victim before killing him. All he cared about was that he was blown to bits. And that's literally what he wrote verbatim. And he ended his short notes on the murder with the lines, quote, $25,000 reward offered, rather flattering. It would later be learned that Scruton was one of Kaczynski's students when he taught at UC Berkeley, but it isn't known if that connection was actually made by Ted or if it was just a horrific coincidence.
And by this time, unfortunately, the FBI still had no true leads on the identity of the Unabomber, but they had gathered some new clues. Starting in 1980, Ted had actually begun inserting a small piece of metal into his bombs with the initial FC stamped into them. They also made note of all the wood references he had made in his bombings, from using wood in the creation to using towns with wood in the name for return addresses on bombs, and actually sending a bomb to a man with the last name Wood. They knew the bomber had access to machine tools and was familiar with engineering, and later investigators would learn that Ted had been secretly using his neighbor Chris Waite's professional machining tools when he wasn't home. One of the most important clues held by the FBI was the locations of the bombs and the methods of delivery. Bombs had been sent all over the U.S., but many had been hand-delivered to the destinations, while others were sent from Chicago, California, and Utah. This was one of the most important pieces of information at the time of the case, though it wouldn't really be used to truly make or break the case at all for a few more years. The biggest issue for the FBI was that their profile of the Unabomber was off because they didn't realize that the suspect could just be living completely off the grid. Instead, they believed that he likely had a wife or girlfriend, huge misprofiling there, but that this person would know there was a part of their home they weren't allowed to enter. They also thought that the bomber would talk about the bombings to his friends, but what they didn't realize is that Ted only talked about his crimes in his private journals. And the most incriminating entries were mathematically coded in case they were ever found. These types of details threw everyone off his scent because even the FBI could not properly profile him. After his streak of bombings in 1985, he slowed his pace for a while, likely worried, about getting caught. This is something that he was always careful about. And it was later discovered that after the December 1985 bombing, Ted began gathering pubic hairs in public restrooms to put in his bombs as a way to throw off detectives. After a year of no more activity, the Unabomber reappeared on February 20th, 1987. He placed an explosive device outside of CAMS, C-A-A-M-S, Inc., in Salt Lake City, Utah. One employee of the shop saw a strange man place a piece of wood in the parking lot, but the store was kind of busy. She was unable to go check it out at the time. So a bit later, another employee, 26-year-old Gary Wright, decided to investigate. It appeared to look like a plain piece of wood with a few nails sticking out of it, which was strange, but it seemed harmless. He reached down to pick it up from one end, and as he lifted it, he heard what he described as a fighter jet taking off. And he thought to himself, quote, "Oh God, I might not make it." It was the sound of the device exploding in his face, and he would later say that everything went in slow motion and described it as being in the Matrix when Keanu Reeves dodges bullets. He remembered after the explosion seeing something that looked like needles threaded through his shirt. It was the long nails Ted had packed into the bomb along with the shrapnel created from the bursting of the pipe bomb itself. Gary was left with serious wounds in his legs and arms, as well as wounds across his face that showed the path of the shrapnel as it flew past his head. He later noted if he had been leaning even an inch more forward, he likely would have died. And yeah, the images of the damage he received are pretty horrific. Just tiny little metal pellets all across his body and slashes across his face. Even though Gary spent a lot of time in the hospital having the shrapnel surgically removed from his body, which seems excruciating, he ended up considering himself lucky. The man before him had been killed with the same style of bomb in a different style package. The bombing of Gary Wright was frustrating to Ted, and he wrote in his journal that the experiment was unsatisfactory. He was possibly more frustrated by the fact that something happened that had never happened before, and this was important. Someone actually caught a glimpse of Ted setting the bomb down. The worker who saw the man place the explosive device was taken to speak with a police sketch artist, and this is when the iconic Unabomber rendering was created. This is very famous police sketch. It's the kind of the sunglasses and the gray hoodie, and this gray hoodie would later actually be found and kind of connect the dots here. But the only problem was that some of the details about the man were incorrect. In the wanted poster that the police put out, the Unabomber was listed as being in his 20s and having reddish blonde hair. Ted was brunette, and at the time he was already 45 years old. After the sighting, Ted decided to lay low for a while, disappearing from the public eye for 5 years. His life during these years is largely unknown. He worked some odd jobs and continued to get money from his parents. Ted's father later died in 1990, though it isn't known if he attended the funeral or not. He also seemed to stop writing in his journals at this time and wrote in journals that weren't found during later investigations. After a few years, it really did seem like he had been scared into hiding for good, but unfortunately, he would return in June of 1993.
Not only did Ted return to blowing up innocent people, but he made sure everyone would know that the Unabomber was to blame. It was June 22nd, 1993, and geneticist Charles Epstein was excelling in his research of Down syndrome. A letter was sent to the man's home in Tiburon, California. Upon opening the letter, it exploded. This was Ted's bomb he labeled experiment number 225. Epstein was instantly pelted with high-velocity shrapnel and was rushed to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Epstein was a prolific researcher respected by colleagues around the world. He was seen as someone who was using his intelligence to better the world. His wife Louise called him a gentle and brilliant man. The bomb resulted in months of excruciating pain, the loss of his fingers, partial loss of his hearing, and the emotional toll of being a victim of a random violent attack. He was furious, but alive. A reporter for the Chronicle, Kevin Fagan, who came to know many of Ted Kaczynski's victims, said that Epstein's rage was even more intense than many of the other victims, and he remained furious until the day he died in 2011, which rightfully so. I mean, this is just so traumatic and probably made doing work very, very difficult from that point on.
An emphasis on using his intelligence to better the world.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge at Ted. Because, man, you were so smart and you could have been like somebody else who used their intelligence for good, but instead you chose this route, I guess.
2 days after Charles Epstein's attack, another mail bomb arrived to its intended target, David Gelernter, the computer professor at Yale University in Connecticut. This bomb detonated at 8:30 a.m. at the Yale Computer Science Center, and 38-year-old David opened the letter while sitting in his office. The explosion blew the glass from the windows and sent shrapnel all across the small room. Luckily, David survived but lost several of his fingers. Just horrible, man. By now, the public was beginning to feel hopeless. It seemed that the Unabomber's reign of terror was never going to end, and somehow the gaps between bombings only made the anxiety worse, which I can definitely understand how terrible that would be. Like, you could be a target at any point in time. To most people, it seems random. I'm sure most people that worked in universities at this time were worried about receiving a package. Some were worried that the man might die before being caught, and the U.S. would be in perpetual fear of another attack. But the FBI couldn't be certain that these bombs were the work of the Unabomber. After all, he hadn't bombed anyone else in Connecticut before, and he had been silent for nearly half a decade. Still, they decided to reinvigorate the Unabomber case, taking new tips from the public, and these tips started flowing in by the thousands, and investigators were overwhelmed trying to separate the quote-unquote crazy people from those with genuine concerns and tips. As time passed, they seemed to be no closer to learning the true identity of the Unabomber. The investigation had become the most expensive in U.S. history, and there were over 150 agents dedicated exclusively to the Unabomber case. By the 1993 bombings, the devices had become even more sophisticated. Ted might have been experimenting in the 5 years he was silent. His explosives no longer needed a pipe to contain the explosive chemicals, and they knew it was only a matter of time before he managed to kill someone else. The FBI were also using new technology to try and track the man down. In 1991, forensic scientists began using DQ alpha genotyping, which is a way to look at the 4 main alleles in small samples of DNA. This had the potential to help narrow down suspects to a smaller percentage of the population. This was done by pulling small bits of DNA from the stamps on the Unabomber's parcels. They were able to narrow down the culprit to someone within a specific 3% of the population. But in 1993, this was still around 8 million people in the US, so not exactly a small pool of individuals.
Still large. Still impressive, though, that they were able to do this.
It just shows how fast, like, the advancement in DNA evidence and investigation went during that time. And with no other DNA evidence, the investigation was slow to move forward until the New York Times received a letter from the Unabomber himself. It turned out that an environmentalist group, or some members claiming to be part of the group, tried to claim credit for one of Ted's bombing victims. There was no way Ted was going to let anyone dilute what he believed was a purposeful mission with a clear message. In his words, quote, "Revert the world to a time before modern technology or suffer." So he wrote a letter claiming responsibility for all of the bombings himself, which is such a serial killer thing to do.
It really is.
It becomes this ego-driven mission. You're like, no, I want credit for this.
Yeah. I don't know if he gets he probably does. He gets like the irony of this modern technology, right? He's using modern technology to build these bombs. He's using the machinery of his neighbor's shop to build these bombs. He's using modern media outlets that would only exist with the technology that we have to print and stuff. And he wants to go to this time before modern technology, but while using modern technology, he probably gets the irony. And I'm assuming that's all part of his game here, his agenda, but it just irks me so much.
Yeah, it says a lot about him as a person.
Yeah.
Beyond his, philosophical ideas and it's these types of things where I really feel like it's difficult to separate, the art, so to speak, from the artist with him.
Yeah.
Is because I really don't feel like this was necessarily about the mission as much as he says it was.
Yeah.
And I go back to his quote on, "This is personal revenge."
Yeah.
And that feeling of isolation and being left behind by society.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, had his upbringing been different and had he not been pushed in this academic direction, would things have been different for him?
Yeah.
Because you look at him and his brother too. His brother's not to the same intelligence necessarily as Ted, but his brother seems like a totally normal guy, and he came from the same family, the same upbringing. So it's like, what happened? And again, we haven't gotten to one of the most critical parts of the story with Ted, where he's involved in some experimentation.
Yes, we'll have to dig into that. That might explain.
I'm sure many of you are like, oh, guys, when are you going to talk about the Harvard experiment, the experiments that he went through? And we'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll unpack that for sure. But yeah, God, and I think the thing of separating, so yeah, okay, I watched some Woody Allen movies. I watched some,
Right. I'm not trying to say like you're bad for doing that.
I was going to say that it really, Woody Allen isn't a domestic terrorist.
Right.
Like Woody Allen's a problematic man who's done some very terrible things. But yeah, the different ball game here, I would say. And yeah, I just personally, we'll get into it later. I don't give a shit about what he has to say about any of this. I don't give a shit about his manifestos.
Yeah, it's not, and to me, I don't read that and be like, this is groundbreaking ideals here.
No, it's really not.
It's like, I think most people have thoughts about this.
Yeah.
It's just living in the age of technology.
Right.
Like, I think we've all probably at some point in time been like, is it really good that we're going in this, especially with AI and everything? Like we've all feel like sat down and be like, does this go in the good direction for, humanity? And would we be better off if we simplified things? And
yeah, it's like, I would love to, turn away from technology, but you can do that in healthy ways, right?
Yeah.
You can turn away from technology in very healthy ways. And this is not healthy at all. Obviously, I'm just stating the obvious, but.
Well, and it really becomes kind of this like, fuck the man, Yeah. And I think one of his big issues is feeling this push or being forced to embrace technology. And like, you can't operate in society without being forced to interact with technology, in some type of way. And really, I think a lot of this just comes back to ego for him of like, he's duping the FBI and, here's this powerful organization, federal law enforcement agency that can't seem to figure this out. And I think that really did something for him, as many serial killers who go years and years without being caught, feeling like, I am smarter than everybody.
Yeah.
And I think that's what it is. It's the ego. It's like, I am this genius. I can outsmart even the top law enforcement agency in the land.
Yeah. And I want to make sure that people give me the credit.
I do credit. Right? Yeah.
So we know this is much more than his manifestos. This
Yes.
isn't about that, at this rate. I'm not sold on that. But here's the letter. And it read, quote, "We are an anarchist group calling ourselves FC. Notice that the postmark on this envelope precedes a newsworthy event that will happen about the time you receive this letter, if nothing goes wrong. This will prove that we knew about the event in advance, so our claim of responsibility is truthful. Ask the FBI about FC. They have heard of us. We will give information about our goals at some future time. Right now, we only want to establish our identity and provide an identifying number that will ensure the authenticity of any future communication from us. Keep this number secret so that no one else can pretend to speak in our name." In his journals, Ted would state that FC stood for Freedom Club, real original, the name of the fictional anti-technology group that truly only consisted of Ted himself. The FBI attempted to trace the letter back to a suspect through DNA or fingerprints, but, Ted was smart and there was none. Fortunately, there was something else. Indentations in the paper left from writing a note on another sheet of paper that had been on top of it. The indentation indicated that the note that had been written said, quote, "Call Nathan R. Wednesday, 7 p.m. The investigators believed the Unabomber had finally made a mistake and released this note to the public. It wasn't much, but they hoped a Nathan R. somewhere in the world would get a call on Wednesday at 7 p.m. and tip them off. It was a long shot, and it didn't pay off because, Ted, he's a conniving bastard, and it was just another red herring that he did intentionally. In December of 1994, the Unabomber had been menacing the United States for 16 years. People hoped his terror would end, but on December 10th, 1994, he struck again. This time, he targeted 50-year-old Thomas Moser, a senior PR executive who had previously worked for Exxon. Thomas received a package in the mail at his North Caldwell, New Jersey home. The package was described as small, white, and neatly wrapped. It was no bigger than a videotape. Thomas stood in his kitchen next to his wife and 15-month-old daughter as he sorted through his mail. His wife, Susan, had brought the package in the day before but left it on the counter for her husband since it was addressed to him. The wife and daughter walked to another room as Thomas opened the package. It immediately exploded and killed Thomas instantly. The bomb was incredibly powerful, even more so than any of the previous ones that Ted had used. It had been so powerful that it had taken out a large chunk of the granite countertop in the kitchen, blew a hole in the wall, and blew out the glass from the windows. Thomas was found by his wife face up on the kitchen floor. His stomach had been slashed open, his face was blackened and distorted, and paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. It is said that when Moser's funeral came, the family had nothing to bury but his shoes. Thomas had worked hard to advance in his career and had recently been promoted to the general manager and executive vice president at Young and Rubicam Inc., one of the most prolific ad agencies in the world. And after his death, the FBI, if they weren't before, they were now. They were extremely desperate. They were taking thousands of calls each week and had increased the reward for information to $1 million.
Yeah, I'd say that's desperate.
Yeah.
Let's not forget they had 150 agents dedicated to this case.
Yeah, that's huge.
And they still couldn't figure it out. Unbelievable. But news of the Unabomber's latest victim spread far and wide in the U.S. At the time, it wasn't as easy to know about national news if you didn't consistently read the newspaper or watch the TV news networks. One of the kinds of people who naturally avoided news was Ted's younger brother, David, who's living 3,000 miles away from Ted in Texas. It was December of 1994, and the death of Thomas Moser was the headline in almost every newspaper, including the one that David picked up that day. He had never even heard of the Unabomber at that point, and he found the article shocking and upsetting. David also hadn't heard from Ted in years. When Ted learned that David was planning on getting married in 1978, he became furious. He wrote to David calling his fiancée Linda Patrick a bad person. He said she was using David and that he shouldn't go through with the wedding. Linda had never even met Ted. She had never spoken to him over the phone or had any interaction with him at all. But it seemed that Ted's hatred toward women and his desperation to find a reason why his brother wasn't like him made him spiral. He convinced himself that David had changed because of Linda, and Linda was evil.
I know growing up, Ted always thought that David kind of looked up to him. He was like, it's the big brother thing. And I think Ted's failure with women completely, and then seeing his little brother succeed in this, that he's getting married, just like totally pissed him off.
Totally sent him over the edge.
Yeah, it's just totally selfish. Never even met Linda, but she's evil.
Right. You should suffer like me, basically.
Exactly.
Nobody understood why Ted would threaten to break contact with David over a problem that didn't exist. Still, Ted wrote his brother off and told him he didn't want to speak to him ever again. Pretty harsh. Linda and David went through with the wedding and Ted didn't attend. After their marriage, Ted never came to visit and he always told David he was too busy. David couldn't imagine what he could be busy with living out in the middle of the woods in Montana, but everything would become much clearer over time. After Ted sent the letter to David in 1978, Linda told him, quote, "You know your brother is mentally ill, right?" David was shocked and defended Ted, saying, "No, he's just different." Linda stood her ground, saying, "People who are healthy in their minds don't think like this." It was hard for David to come to terms with the idea that there might be something wrong with his brother Ted. He had looked up to him all his life and he thought he was a genius who's going to save the world, which maybe he could have.
He could have been.
If he had put his genius mind to good use.
Yep.
When the couple read the Unabomber article in 1994 and looked into the FBI profile, Linda read a few of the details of the interests of the Unabomber. She noticed the profile said the suspect would have an obsession with anti-technology. Linda immediately told David that it sounded like Ted. David thought that there was no way that Linda must be wrong. His brother would never do anything like that. He was blind to who his brother truly was and continued to think of Ted through the lens of an adoring younger sibling. Linda ended up dropping the subject, at least for a little while. And then in April of 1995, the New York Times received another letter from the Unabomber. It was a 3-page letter that took credit for the bombing of Thomas Moser and continued on to say that the FC group will continue to make terroristic attacks unless the New York Times agreed to publish his manifesto, which he would send at a later date. He also takes time to add to the letter that he believes the FBI is a joke and that they tried to blame the bombings on a, quote, isolated nut, but that it is an entire group of passionate, angry individuals. The Unabomber claimed that his attacks were out of environmental concern, and there is no doubt that Ted was incredibly passionate about the destruction of nature and humanity through the creation of technology, but his writings and behavior suggested that he wanted to kill without any moral reason. Still, Ted, claiming to be an environmentalist group, was fairly believable. At the time, environmental activist groups like Earth First performed radical demonstrations and protests, which that whole part of history is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Pretty wild to see what some of those demonstrations were.
And I think he was just hiding behind that curtain, really, at the end of the day. He was trying to take something culturally in vogue and just hide behind that, like he had some agenda or motive behind this.
Well, and he clearly thinks he's like 2 steps ahead of law enforcement at all times.
Yeah.
And so he's crafty when it comes to, putting distance in between himself.
Yeah.
Personally,
and I mean, credit where credit is due. He is very crafty, and he has been a few steps ahead of police, On April 24th, 1995, Ted's final bomb arrived at its destination, the Timber Association of California. The package was addressed to William Dennison, but was opened by the president of the California Forestry Association, who was Gilbert Murray, who held an office in the building. According to witnesses, a female receptionist was attempting to open the package, but was struggling and asked Murray for assistance. He gladly grabbed the package and opened it, at which point the bomb detonated, blowing the doors and windows from the building. The bomb exploded just after 2 p.m., instantly killing Murray. The blast was intense. It destroyed his office and caused catastrophic damage to his body. The 47-year-old man was popular in the nearby capital and beloved by his family. He was a husband, father, Vietnam veteran who had recently taken over the position of president at his company, and the entire nation was then terrified. The post office even threatened to stop sending packages until the Unabomber was caught. Reporters and people with connections to the oil and forestry industry were now terrified to open any packages or letters addressed to them. It had been 17 years of bombings at this point, and the terror was only getting worse. In June of 1995, 2 months after the death of Gilbert Murray, the Unabomber, addressing himself as FC, sent a letter to the San Francisco Chronicle claiming that there was going to be a bomb on an airliner out of Los Angeles International Airport in the next 6 days. Those in the newsroom were torn. They didn't know if they should tell the public to warn them or if that playing into the Unabomber's hands would be a bad decision. But their final decision was to call the FBI, who later determined the threat did originate from the true Unabomber. Then they decided to print the story. After the threatening deadline passed, though, there was no explosion, and they realized the Unabomber was only playing a game to mess with them. There was never a planned attack at the LA International Airport. On June 25th, 1995, Ted sent out 5 prints of his hand-typed manifesto to major publications across the U.S. And by this point, the FBI determined the man was typing all of his letters and his manifesto on an old L.C. Smith & Corona typewriter. The process of typing out 5 copies of the manifesto would have been tedious and time-consuming, and FBI agents believed he would have sent more copies if he had the time to create them. 1 copy of the manifesto made it to the San Francisco Chronicle. The author was clearly highly intelligent, but not a great writer. Suck it, Ted. Looks like there's a few things you can't do. The question was, do they print the manifesto and keep this terrorist happy, or refuse to negotiate and keep it to themselves? So at first, the FBI went back and forth on what to do. And after hours of debating, they decided not to publish this manifesto. And as they prepared to leave the room, one person turned and said, quote, "That was the wrong decision, wasn't it?" And everyone in the room basically instantly agreed. It's kind of like I don't know, what do they call that? When you know in your heart of hearts, like when you flip a coin, you kind of know the answer when it's halfway into the air. So that it's like as they're leaving, they're all like, fuck no.
Yeah.
We know what the right thing to do is, right?
Intuition?
Yeah, it's basically that. Yeah. They renegotiated and decided that they could potentially find someone who would read the document and recognize who wrote it.
Yeah.
That's really smart right there.
Yeah.
So the San Francisco Chronicle printed the manifesto. Obviously, this is pretty problematic because it's like we're giving this terrorist a voice, but hopefully something can come of this. The message was around 35,000 words and spanned several pages. I think it's about 40 typed pages. I could be wrong. Immediately, the paper sold out across the country. Tips came flying into the FBI.
You think they made the right call?
Yes. I mean, history says they did.
Yeah,
But
right.
I don't know. If I was sitting in that room, I would feel very torn. Just knowing that I would be giving a terrorist a massive voice, publishing it in something in a newspaper that big. Ugh. I don't know. What do you think you would do?
I think probably I would have printed it because I think this is already the most expensive investigation in history.
True, yeah.
And the amount of resources that have been expended to try to figure out who this guy is that have failed. And, I'm sure there were conversations of what if we never find this guy?
Yeah.
So
it's almost sunk cost fallacy, but it kind of works out.
Yeah.
Because they're like, what else do we have? Really?
I think too, the desperation to find him and stop him from further bombing is kind of outweighs the cons to printing this dude's manifesto. Because, ultimately, if you print the manifesto, and as we know, what happens next, obviously that leads them to the bomber. But if you don't, then you run the risk of more bombings. It could enrage him. He could step it up. He could just go crazy and a lot more people die.
Yeah.
And then how do those people feel that decided not to print it?
Right.
Now you got blood on your hands that could have been prevented had you just printed it, which would have maybe appeased him for some time and ultimately led to more tips. Because if you think about it in today's terms, everybody has the ability to get the word out to the internet, right? And so now it doesn't really matter. Obviously, still would be a big decision for like a major news publication
at the time,
media publication.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now you just post it to Facebook.
Yeah, YouTube for a while had terrorists posting, messages to it, and that's obviously changed quite a bit. But still, things crazy.
Fuck you, YouTube.
Crazy things still happen on YouTube.
Yeah,
live streams of things. So I think no matter what, those people are going to get out what they want to the public or whatever. So why not use it as a tool to try and find this person? I think they made the
best call. I would my conscience would.
Yeah, I think
like,
the moral dilemma is like, it feels icky, right? You're like, I'm giving this guy the publicity that he wants, that he's asking for.
Yeah, that strokes the ego, which is kind of part of the issue here, so... But it's a tactical move. You play into his game.
Kind of reverse psychology on him. Like, oh yeah, we'll inflate your ego, but it'll expose you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think it was 100% the right move. But this manifesto or his document is titled "Industrial Society and Its Future." In it, Ted presented his critiques of modern industrial society in an argument that technological progress and the pursuit of material wealth have led to the erosion of human freedom, dignity, and autonomy. Which if you just take that statement right there and you look at it, you're like, all right.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
I'm on board.
Subjectively, I think you could be like, okay, that makes sense to me. If you just look at it from that, aerial view, he advocated for return to more primitive way of life and called for rejection of modern technology. The manifesto also discussed the psychological and social impacts of technology and warns of widespread societal collapse if his proposed changes were not implemented. Again, something subjectively you could look at. You look at social media. What has that done for society?
Yeah, it's been awful.
It's done a lot of bad.
Yeah.
And at the same token, there's good things about social media.
Agreed.
I feel like it's separated us, but I think it's connected us. I think you could debate, how much it's connected us versus separated us.
Yeah, true.
But it has made the world a smaller place, so to speak.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's arguments for both sides, I think, for a lot of these statements that he presents in his manifesto.
Yeah. I think, I don't know, we don't have to crack open the whole social media
I mean, it's
thing,
a whole can of worms.
If someone wants to critique social media though, I can, just a blanket statement on that. I can, I'm on board, but it's hard. It's tough because it's weird that coming from a guy who is so socially isolated. Do you think Ted Kaczynski, obviously he wouldn't be on social media, but do you think that if social media were to have existed when he was growing up, do you think it would have maybe changed him a little bit? Maybe he could have found some connections through online gaming or just some internet forums and stuff. Like, do you think he would have felt more isolated or a little bit more connected? Maybe it could have actually helped him in the end. I don't know. Just spitballing an idea here.
I think it's a great point. I think absolutely he could have found some sort of connection. I mean, most people do. If you don't have that connection in real life, people are still finding it elsewhere. And online has created the ability to find people to connect with. I mean, there's so many stories, and now there's whole TV shows of people who found connections online or found love online.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like Ted would have 100% participated in online dating and stuff.
Ted would have got married on World of Warcraft.
Possibly. Yeah. He could have been one of those people, which maybe technology could have curved him in a more positive direction and felt like he had a community he could belong with and connect with other people who are geniuses. Is there a genius fraternity? Is there a club for these guys to hang out at? Probably, he would have found his community at some point. I mean, he seems like a resourceful guy. So I think technology, would have absolutely served him well in that way. Would it have overwritten his views on the environment though, and how it's affected, all these other factors? I think that's where it's, I don't know, how deeply did he believe in nature and
right. Yeah. I'm not sure. But also, I mean, on the other side of that coin, now that I'm thinking about social media, it could have taken him down an even darker path.
True.
He could have had access to
many
how
people.
To build a bomb and
right.
He could have went down really dark path.
He would have been on 4chan.
Yeah.
Or the dark web.
Yeah.
He could have figured out how to get into the dark web and really get serious material. So
yeah.
So I think it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. It's tough to really debate this, because it's just, I really would be curious to see how he would have been, growing up 20 years later. Even what did the internet come out? What the
90s?
I think
maybe
the
late
internet
80s?
launched. I want to say it was the late 80s.
1983.
83.
Oh, 83.
Shit,
so
damn.
he was right there.
Yeah.
Obviously, it wasn't accessible to just the average person early on, and computers were expensive, and he wanted nothing to do with any of that. But
true. And it's not like there weren't really chat rooms in 1983.
Right. When did Instant Messenger launch?
I don't know when Instant Messenger launched, but the World Wide Web became available to the public in 1993. So 10 years after the internet was born.
So he could have left the hermit lifestyle behind and just rejoined civilization, and could have had a totally different experience.
Yeah.
I think he would have found friends, other recluses around the world. I think, I'll call it what he is. He's an incel.
Yeah.
I think he would have found a community in the other violent incels online. And I think it would have just exacerbated the situation and made it worse.
Yeah.
I think it's probably good that he didn't have that kind of access to other people.
Yeah. He would have been red pilled.
100%.
Total piece of shit. Yeah. Yeah.
But a lot of his arguments in the manifesto have sparked deep conversations among scholars, philosophers, sociologists, environmentalists, and policymakers. And if you're interested in diving into the manifesto in a bit more detail and kind of having it broken down for you, there's actually a great YouTube video I watched yesterday by the channel called Horses. It's called The Unabomber's Ideas Explained. It's like a 15-minute video or 15 minutes or so. And it just kind of breaks down a lot of the ideals and simplifies it a little bit and kind of, I don't know, made it a little bit easier for me to digest. Again, he wasn't the greatest writer, so we just go try to read it verbatim. I think it's a little confusing.
And, for sure. But yeah, if you want to read about the Anti-Technology Manifesto, just hop on your technological devices.
Right.
And
just Google it. Yeah.
Get fucked, Ted.
So obviously, discussions around these topics are often overshadowed by the heinous crimes he committed. And according to Ted, he claims that in order for people to hear him, he had to do these bombings, which is just a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't believe it.
Bullshit. Nobody needs to be killed to get an idea across.
Yep.
It doesn't matter how good you think your idea is. Love, peace is more important than whether or not you think we should have cars on the street. Or computers or.
And like you were saying before, I mean, you go back into his earlier journal entries, it's all right there. He wanted to kill out of revenge. He just wanted to kill people. This is just a facade. This is just a cover up now in his late game where it's like, maybe he's seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. So he's trying to cover it up with like, no, you know what? I want my legacy to be that I did these things for a cause when he really didn't.
Yeah. Do you think he ever thought he was going to actually like spur a revolution in people? Like, do you think he had grandiose visions of delusional ideas of
probably,
oh, if I do this and people start reading my manifesto, they're going to get inspired to join me in this fight against technology? Because he obviously thought we're better off just like blowing up civilization as it is right now, returning to, the olden days and living off the land, versus letting technology run its course where it'll eventually destroy us. It'll do more damage if we let that happen. So might as well just get it out of the way and just blow it all up right now and start over.
I could see that he would have delusions of like, I might actually change the world at the end of this. That's totally possible.
When in reality, didn't do a damn thing other than kill a few innocent people and injure 20 plus others. And now your legacy is just you're an evil motherfucker.
Yep. If you, like we said, if he actually wanted to make some change, he could have used his big old noggin to do anything else.
Yeah, he could have just went into politics.
Yeah.
Just like everybody else who has grandiose visions of the future.
He would have been the least charismatic politician you could ever see in the world.
Well, he can join the club with all the other
true
nut jobs in politics. Yeah, or like, I'm surprised, like I could see him, had he had the social skills, you think he could have like been a cult leader, like started his own like cult? Maybe. Which again, I think goes back to your point, Danny, that it's probably a good thing he didn't get access to technology, because he might have, his ego might have been blown up to, infinity, where he's like, oh, there's all these other people that agree with me. So why don't we all gather and get together? And all of a sudden he's got an army of serial bombers. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's probably good for that very reason that he was so isolated and in his little cabin on a typewriter and by candlelight typing his manifesto.
Yeah.
Which sounds crazy to say because like there's no good result of any of this, but I guess the
silver lining
is that had he been willing to try it out, maybe it would have been far worse. So, well, I mean, if you look at some of the other individuals like Timothy McVeigh that I mentioned earlier, he's another one who had these like very strong ideals about the government and what they were doing. And, the damage that he did is, significant, through the Oklahoma City bombing and all that. That was, and then the World Trade bombing and all that. So in comparison, I guess I don't know where I'm going.
It's It's a tough one to unpack here.
Yeah, my head's starting to spin. I'm starting to.
But I wonder if this is kind of what he wants. Like, he wants us to redirect our attention off of the killings and start focusing on his ideologies. Even now, he's gone, he's dead, and we still want to talk about his philosophies rather than, like, at the end of the day, man, you are just a terrorist and a murderer. And that should be the bottom line. And so maybe he's trying to get us into these conversations. Maybe from the grave, this guy is still pulling these threads on us, which I don't like.
Yeah,
all right,
I don't
Ted,
like it either.
I hope you're rotting in hell.
Well, when the manifesto was released in the paper, Linda and David rushed out to get a copy, but they were sold out. So they decided to use a new technology at the time, as we were just talking about, the internet.
Hey.
So they traveled to a local college library and began searching for a print of the manifesto online, and they finally found it. They sat there and read together, and Linda watched David's face as his jaw just dropped. The similarity in the writing and the letters he received from his brother were eerily similar. David, still trusting in his brother, told Linda, quote, "If I had to guess, maybe there's 1 chance in 1,000 this is him." Which 1 chance in 1,000, that's pretty good odds there in comparison.
Yeah.
And that's when Linda looked at him and responded, "Well, that's not nothing." Actually, I have a quick little clip here of an interview with Linda and David in 2016. Let's take a listen here.
That must have been awful for you to have the suspicion that you're going to share with this man who you love.
Yes, but it was really important to talk with Dave about it.
When she said, "Well, I think maybe your brother's the Unabomber," I thought, well, this is not anything to worry about. Ted's never been violent. I've never seen him violent.
Linda's suspicions kept growing.
They had posted the first few pages of the manifesto on the screen computer in the lobby of the library. So Dave went with me, and then as Dave read the first page, I was sitting at his side and his jaw dropped.
I thought I was going to read the first page of this, turn to Linda and say, "See, I told you so." But on an emotional level, it just sounded like my brother's voice.
That must have been an insane moment.
Dude, I can't
to
imagine.
realize, like, oh my God, could it be him?
I would have felt sick to my stomach.
Yeah. Well, Linda encouraged David to, which Linda here is kind of a hero in this case. I mean, she really urged David to, like, look into this further, because she clearly had a very strong inkling that this was Ted. This was Ted's writing here. And so she encouraged David to at least have a professional look at some of Ted's letters and then compare them to the manifesto to see if there were genuine similarities. David agreed, and they reached out to Susan Swanson, a private investigator and longtime friend of Linda's. Susan examined the letters and thought that they could have been written by the same person. The language across the documents were very similar. For instance, in a letter to David, Ted wrote, quote, "I've got to know that every last tie joining me to the stinking family has been cut. Forever." A line in the manifesto read, quote, "It would be better to dump the whole stinking system and take the consequences." Susan felt the writings had the same tone and started looking into more details of the Unabomber case. She began recognizing the similarities between some of the bombing locations and universities where Ted either went to school or worked. Doing the FBI's job at this point.
Yeah, seriously.
David had told Susan that Ted would sometimes hitch a ride to Helena, Montana, and then catch a bus straight through to the San Francisco Bay Area. Susan called around to the bus depots and transportation agencies and learned that there was not a single option for a bus that took that trip that did not pass through Salt Lake City. Suddenly, Ted could be placed at all locations, and David realized the reality of the situation. He knew that if he did nothing, and Ted was guilty, someone could die because of his inaction. But if he turned his brother in, Ted could get the death penalty, so he's got a major dilemma here. It made David reflect on the trauma of Ted's past and the promises David had made to his mother many years before. Decades earlier, Ted was a young man struggling to fit in with the older boys in school. David, who is 7 years younger than Ted, asked his mom one day, quote, "Mom, what is wrong with Teddy? Why doesn't he have any friends?" David's mother took him to the side and told him a story. When Ted was only a baby, he fell ill with a fever and a mysterious rash. His mother and father rushed the infant to the hospital where doctors treated his mystery illness for multiple weeks. During that time, Ted was kept secluded in the hospital. Wanda, his mother, was only allowed to see her son for 2 hours a week. She said that when Ted had left for the hospital, he had been a typical baby. He smiled, giggled, reached for people, made eye contact, and loved everyone. When he came home, he was a shell of the child he had been. He no longer laughed or wanted to interact with his parents in the same way. Over the years, Wanda and Theodore hoped their son would overcome the obstacles of his early life, but as his social life deteriorated, she figured that Ted was terrified of being abandoned again and had been irreparably damaged by the doctors refusing to allow his mother to care for him in those weeks. Which that's very interesting to me, that whole story, because I think there is some scientific significance around being taken, from your mother that young.
Yeah, there's a condition, I can't remember. We had covered it in a previous episode of not being held.
Yeah.
Is like, can cause some psychological problems later in life, especially not being held by your mother.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of hospitals these days, immediately after your child is born, do direct contact with the mother now.
Yep.
They used to just like whisk your baby away to another room and you wouldn't see them for however long until they're done. But now it's like straight out right onto mama's chest.
Yeah, as it should
be,
right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we've done for literally thousands of years. We like pull the baby out and put him right on your chest.
There was no mysterious man just like stealing your kid and taking
put him in the cart and wheel him away. But then she told David, quote, "Promise me you'll never abandon your brother." David was shocked and told her, "Of course, I promise. I love Teddy. I would never abandon him." So he's still remembering this from all those years ago. But in 1995, as a man realized his brother may be the most wanted man in America, he was suddenly faced with a decision he couldn't bear.
David and Linda reached out to the FBI with their theories and expected their world would instantly turn upside down. But weeks went by and they didn't hear a thing. And the reality was that the FBI at the time, they were just overwhelmed by the amount of tips they were getting. Eventually, they narrowed the tips down to 2,417 viable suspects. And you know where Ted Kaczynski was on that list? He was number 2,416.
Wow.
Almost dead last. Around this time, Ted and David's mother fell ill and widowed. There was nobody to take care of her, so David had to fly out to Chicago and stay with his mother in her house. While he was there, he decided to follow a suggestion from Susan and look more into Ted's letters that could be compared to the manifesto. And what he found was something even more incriminating. Deep in a stack of old letters, it was a 23-page manuscript that appeared to be a rough draft of the printed manifesto. So they immediately called the local FBI field office. An agent there took the document and reached out to the main investigation team, begging for someone to just look at the document before it fell into the huge pile of tips where it could be overlooked. So Joel Moss of the Unabomber task force had the agent fax the info over, and he looked at it and realized, we got the guy. We're dealing with the same exact person here. They finally knew who the Unabomber was, and that was Theodore J. Kaczynski. Despite the major break in the case, the FBI now had to find concrete evidence to tie Ted to the bombings. So to do this, they needed to get into the man's cabin. But obviously, this wasn't going to be easy. The terrain was unfamiliar, the man was suspicious of strangers, and he was known to have at least one weapon on the property, not to mention the entire property could be rigged with explosives as far as they knew. I think that's a good guess. This guy is a serial bomber. Why wouldn't he have rigged the whole place with explosives? So they decided that their best bet for a successful apprehension of Ted was to use his neighbor, Butch Gearing. They asked Butch what he knew about Ted. Butch told them he was a hermit and he didn't really bother anyone. The agents then revealed they believed he was the Unabomber. At first, Butch, he couldn't even believe it. He's been living next to this man for years, but after they assured him, he immediately asked how he could help the investigation. Years later, FBI agent Max Knoll said that Butch was his, quote, eyes and ears going forward with the rest of the investigation. Butch's task was simple, but obviously terrifying. He needed to walk around Ted's property with a video camera so that the FBI could get a good idea of the terrain surrounding Ted's cabin. Good Lord. Imagine that, like knowing who this guy is now, and the FBI is saying you have to take a video camera. A guy who hates technology too.
Yeah.
Now you got to go scope out his property with a
who
video
you've seen
camera.
Aiming rifles at your family. Like,
right. Terrifying. But hey, Butch, he sacked up. He didn't hesitate. Shortly after their conversation, the FBI was in possession of the video that showed the terrain right up to the front door of Ted's secluded shack. Woo! They wanted to take time to come up with an expert plan to apprehend him without giving him a chance to flee or hole up with a weapon. Unfortunately, CBS News had also caught wind of the story and let the FBI know that they didn't care about their plans, which, what the hell, CBS? They wanted to break the story before anyone else because you know what? The bottom line trumps the FBI investigation here. We want to be the first ones to run this story. That's crazy that they were about to ruin this whole thing. They were going to run the whole story with Ted's name in it in 24 hours. So they were giving the FBI the deadline. Wild. The FBI, obviously, they had no choice. I mean, freedom of the press, they couldn't stop them. They immediately gathered their men and flew to Lincoln, Montana. On April 3rd, 1996, 3 plainclothes officers, they walked up to Ted's property and casually hollered out, "Is anyone home?" Ted saw the men and assumed they were land surveyors. He opened the door and they said they were from the Nordic Drilling Company.
Which I think, there's some great footage of this in the Unabomber documentary on Netflix. And the guys that walked up to the cabin were FBI agents, but they didn't look like your typical like young dudes in like suits and ties. They were like these old weathered looking guys, scraggly clothes, definitely looked the part. They pulled it off for sure.
Yeah. And Ted, he stepped back from the door. He would later say he was just going to put shoes on, but the men thought he was about to close himself in the cabin with his weapons. They thought, he kind of figured out what was going on. Or they were like, "Hey, we're from a drilling company." And Ted was like, "These guys, I don't know
about
why."
To come out and murder us.
Yeah. I don't know why they wanted to say they were from a drilling company, which Ted...
Why not just rush him?
Yeah.
It's a 1-bedroom cabin.
Right, yeah. So one of the men, acting really quickly, he reached out and grabbed Ted. So they did rush his ass and they pulled him out of the cabin. The other men placed him in handcuffs as dozens of men began popping up on the hills and tree lines, having been previously camouflaged in the nearby terrain.
Yeah, this place surrounded. Like for real. An army of agents.
He was
out
not
there.
getting out. Yeah. Wendy Gearing, Butch's wife, said the hills were clear, and then suddenly there were over 80 agents in plain view jumping up and down saying, "We got him, we got him." The agents had been disguised in ghillie suits and placed in other nearby cabins as well. Additional SWAT teams were placed even further out in case Ted somehow evaded arrest. So there was no way that he was...
there was no escaping this. Yeah. Immediately, the news broke. The Unabomber was finally arrested. By now, Ted had killed 3 people and injured 23 more during his nationwide bombing campaign over the span of 17 years. It's crazy. David watched the TV footage of the officers walking his brother through the streets, handcuffed and looking dirty and ragged.
Here's David talking about seeing his brother on TV that evening.
Well, the 3 of us were sitting together, Linda, myself, and my mother, watching the arrest of my brother on TV. I've never seen a street person that looked worse off than Ted looked at that moment. His clothes were tattered. Apparently he had not bathed in weeks or months. I'm still sort of haunted by the look on his face.
Yeah, I mean, he looks in incredibly rough shape here.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, definitely one with nature there. God. Man. I mean, it's honestly, it must have been so shocking for people to get a glimpse at this guy. And this whole time, the dude that's been invading the FBI almost 20 years is this raggedy ass dude in a shack in the middle of nowhere.
It's wild.
It's nuts. David and Linda were angry because the FBI had promised they would be notified before Ted's arrest and that they would try to keep their names out of the press. Well, didn't really happen. When CBS got their tip, they didn't waste any time. the FBI had to act fast, and by the time they were in position to speak with the media, the story had already been run with the line, quote, "They arrested a suspect in Montana after he had been fingered by a relative."
Strange choice of words here.
Why they use fingered?
Right. They could have said identified.
Somebody, I hope, lost their job after that line. That is just foul, honestly.
I lost a lot of respect for CBS. I know this happened a long time ago, but man, CBS is like, we're gonna give the FBI a deadline for arresting this guy. We're running the story, and also we're gonna use terrible verbiage.
Yeah, I feel bad for David and Linda, because that's just they did him dirty.
Yeah, they did.
God, that statement hurt David deeply and said it didn't reflect at all the intense mental battle that went into talking to the FBI about Ted. Yeah, it just seems like whatever you went through, he's like, what's gonna sound good?
Yeah, it's gonna sell some papers.
For many Americans, the moment Ted Kaczynski was arrested, they all felt like they could finally relax. But that wasn't the case for Ted's victims or his brother. The media swarmed David and Linda's house, harassing the family for interviews, and it got so intense that Linda recalled the neighborhood children marching up the sidewalk in front of the media parade and shouting, "Go away! Leave these people alone!" David knew they wanted an interview, but he would rather walk into a fire than walk into that pit of paparazzi and speak about his brother's crimes. And I don't blame you.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the FBI raided Ted's cabin and found a stash of evidence. They found Ted's journals, coded confessions, bomb materials, the hoodie and sunglasses from the sketch artist drawing. They also found 2 rifles, a handgun, a hunting bow, shoes with different size soles, and a series of bottles containing various liquids and powders, including strychnine and gunpowder. There was also a box of stamps and countless metal pipes. So very clear they found their guy. But here's some footage that was taken of the inside with FBI agent Terry Turchi, and he talks about what they found.
I was with another agent, Pat Webb. Pat was an explosives agent. So we kind of opened the door just a bit to the cabin. And as we opened the door, we were both pretty much overcome. As we looked across the cabin at the shelves that were built on the other side of the door, we could see coffee cans and bottles and jars, and they all had labels on them, and they were very meticulously done. And we could see that some were labeled with the name of certain chemicals. One of the things we saw was a hooded sweatshirt, that was hanging up there. And the cabin smelled as if you might start to think, if you really think about this. This is a person who lived in this cabin, had a cutaway spot in the floor to go to the bathroom in if he needed to, and had built fires in the cabin. There was an old potbelly stove in there. So the smell of smoke was in everything. Pat Webb turns to me and he has tears in his eyes and one running down his cheek. And he said, "This is it. We found the Unabomber. At long last, this is over."
And finally, the agents found a cardboard box. Inside was a plastic bag, and inside of that bag was a box covered in aluminum foil. And they backed away slowly, realizing, oh no, it's another bomb. When David learned that they found another bomb in Ted's cabin, he said he finally felt relief in the guilt he felt for turning in his brother. But Ted was still furious at David for turning him in, and he disowned his brother. Reportedly, when he first heard David turn him in, Ted told his attorney, quote, "That can't be true. David loves me. He would never do that." Despite the evil things Ted did, the pain of losing his brother felt like too much for David to bear. So he was focused on trying to advocate for Ted to receive a life sentence over the death penalty. And here's a quick little clip of Ted talking about his brother in an interview he did in 1999.
I would say it's the deepest personal relationship that I ever had between my teens and about 1990 when I finally broke off with him.
Right. In terms of you and David, how do you think that you two are most alike?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Over many years, we shared a great many values.
Right.
And it's not clear to me to what extent this was simple imitation of me on his part. And if it was simple imitation on his part, you wouldn't really call it a similarity.
Right.
But there's some similarities apart from that. I think we're both basically quiet, somewhat introverted types, both a little on the shy side. Another similarity between us would be that, generally speaking, I think he's a very honest person.
You wrote that his adulation of you disgusted you at certain points over the course of your relationship. Yeah. Did you try to communicate that to him? Did you say to him, Dave, this is not a healthy way to be. I'm glad you like me. Yeah. I'm glad you respect me, but be your own person. Did you ever try to have that kind of conversation with him?
No.
Why not? I mean...
And it would have been very painful to him to have me say that. And it probably wouldn't have done any good.
Yeah.
And I mean, I could, in one way and another, he would appear to be overvaluing me, but it wasn't something that was so explicit that I could be sure that it was really that.
Right. In your dreams, literally in your dreams, and in your thinking. It sounds as you really felt protective of David for many, many years, yes?
Yeah.
Do you think at some point that he ever began to feel protective of you? Do you think that as he moved into adulthood, especially after you had cut off communication, do you think that he ever began to feel protective of you?
No.
You don't? In what ways, if any, do you think he was jealous of you?
He's probably jealous of the fact that I got more attention from our parents. He was jealous of the fact that simply that I was dominant in our relationship. Jealous of the fact that I was smarter than he was. I could do most things better than he could. Athletics are one exception.
In what ways, if any, were you jealous of Dave?
The only way I can think that I might have been somewhat jealous of him was that when he was in high school, he always had lots of friends. He was socially successful, and I wasn't. And I may have had some jealousy about that, though I don't clearly remember that.
In June of 1996, Ted was charged with 3 counts of murder. His lawyers wanted Ted to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, which Ted absolutely did not want to do. He later told Teresa Kintz, an Earth First activist and the only person he agreed to sit with for an interview, that he was furious that his lawyers wanted to portray him as insane. He thought it completely undermined his manifesto, and he said that if people thought he was crazy, they wouldn't believe any of his theories. His lawyers didn't care about Ted's opinion and chose an open argument that included showing a picture of Ted well-dressed for his career as a professor compared to the photo of him being arrested. They posed that mental illness is what changed a clean, educated man with a good job into a mountain recluse focused on destruction. The insanity defense meant the prosecution needed to prove that Ted was capable of understanding what he was doing was wrong at the time of his crimes. After his arrest, John Zerzan, an anarchist philosopher, began corresponding with Ted, and not to support the things that he had done, but to get an understanding of his mind and his goals. He said that he didn't think Ted was insane to the point that he was incompetent. He lacked empathy and social understanding, but he knew what he did was against the law, and he simply just didn't care. In fact, his heinous acts were intentional because he was trying to make a point, or at least that was his excuse. John referred to Ted as friendly and saw nothing at all to suggest that the man was quote-unquote crazy. Later, Ted was examined by psychologist Sally Johnson, and the examinations and assessments took almost 20 hours, after which she determined he was capable of standing for trial, but clearly suffered from paranoid schizophrenia.
So in the years since Ted's trial, there have been countless studies done that show that those suffering from schizophrenia often have low EQs or emotional quotients. This makes it difficult for someone like Ted to understand emotions, identify emotions in others, relate to others on a deeper level, or participate in social communication. Ted once had a few friends at one point. Remember in college, he had a few friends, at least one good friend, and they called him shy, but they didn't truly believe that he was antisocial or incapable of understanding empathy. During these studies, certain experiments Ted participated in while attending Harvard University were revealed, and this is what we touched on a little bit earlier. During the formation of their case, the defense team discovered fragmentary files from Harvard University, and these files, they discussed an experiment in which Ted participated when he was only 16 years old until he was about 19 years old. During this 3-year study, Ted met with the proctor on a weekly basis. So the goal of this study, it was to see what intense stress through cruel interrogation patterns would actually do to a subject, or if most people were resilient to those experiences. This meant that every time Ted showed up for his weekly meeting, he was subjected to intense verbal beatings over his looks, his lifestyle, his family, insecurities, and even his intelligence. Ted's case in particular was a lot of files and recordings that are sealed and unavailable to the public research records for unknown reasons, but it is widely accepted that this type of experimentation would not be allowed in the United States in the modern day, and is only the type of cruel experimentation that could have been done, before the 1970s. Things were a bit different back then. Well, like the Stanford prison experiment, when was that? Do you guys remember what year that was?
Yeah, I was going to say too, there's a lot of people that, and I did a little research on this. There's a lot of people that allude to that these Harvard experiments are related to MK Ultra. Because the MK Ultra, as we know, was a real project that was declassified eventually, but it was running during this period of time in history. And I believe Henry Murray of the Harvard Psychological Clinic did have ties to the CIA in one form or another. And so it's been reported by some people out there. Again, I don't think any of this can be confirmed 100% fact, but a lot of people allude to the fact that these were actually experiments being done as part of the MK Ultra CIA project.
So you think there might have been a chance that they were slipping some form of hallucinogens?
Possibly, yeah. Because they did a lot of experiments with different psychedelics and other types of drugs. They were trying to figure out if they could mind control people, interrogation techniques. This was the Cold War era. So that was, something they were spending a lot of resources and time on. So, there's always the theory that gets put out there that I always find interesting. I don't know how much real factual evidence there is to back up these claims, but it is interesting that, he went through this from age 16 to 19. And I mean, these, we're kind of understating just how traumatic these experiments really were and how hard they would have been on somebody who's 16 years old to 19 years old.
Yeah, and I think someone who is probably already insecure because he can't connect with women, because he can't connect with friends, I think, then subjecting him to these sessions of verbal abuse like that probably screw him up a little bit more.
And I mean, that's as far as we know. Could there have been physical things going on there?
Yeah, they are sealed files.
Right. So I think some people claim that it was really these experiments, these MK Ultra experiments that he went through that kind of spurred him in this new direction, or he was brainwashed into becoming who he ultimately became. And I mean, the conspiracy around the MK Ultra project is, it runs deep and even runs into, almost every mass killer today. Somebody brings up MK Ultra. I think it's interesting to think about. I don't know how much proof there actually is to back it up, but I think it's worth mentioning because I do believe there is ties. Henry Murray, who head up this project or experiments at Harvard, did have some connections with the CIA. I think somebody actually did find evidence to support that. But again, I don't think there's ever been an official document or anything that claims that the experiments that Ted Kaczynski went through at Harvard were in fact part of the MK Ultra. So it is interesting to mention, but definitely, not confirmed fact. So I'll just say that.
And also those years, 16 to 19 years old, that is, I think, the most pivotal moment, especially for men, where if you are already kind of predisposed to mental health issues, that's when they kind of bloom.
Right. Yeah.
And they could kind of take over during that time period. So there could be a lot going on here that we're really just not sure about. Unfortunately, like we said, those files are sealed, and I don't know.
But I think it's very clear that these experiments were unethical. They were
yes, definitely
harmful. And I think there's a lot of debate at what the effects of these experiments were on Ted specifically. The diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia is kind of interesting to me. Was that something that was an underlying issue all along, or is that something that happened as a result of the experiments? I mean, you could speculate all day on kind of where things, what was that kind of like big moment where things turned in this whole other dark direction. I think there's evidence to suggest that this goes back even way before the experiments, though. I think they go back to his early days. But again, some people are like, well, maybe had he not gone through these experiments, maybe he wouldn't have become the Unabomber. And so, yeah, I mean, just something interesting to think about. But again, there's no concrete proof that that's what it was. And again, Ted even says himself, like, no, those experiments didn't have anything to do with why I did this. But is that somebody that is brainwashed? Would they say that? I don't know.
And he was also, I think he wanted to come off as mentally sound so that he would have the credibility so people would read his writings. So I think he was very adamant on him being emotionally and mentally sound so that it wouldn't undermine his writings. So I think who knows if he was telling the truth or not.
Right.
But unfortunately, Ted, he never told his family about these experiments. No one really knew what was going on. Like we said before, these were being performed by Henry Murray of the Harvard Psychological Clinic. Some supporters of Henry Murray claimed that the experiment was not some horrific situation that pushed a man to become a killer, but others see the situation a bit differently. Ted was, it's important to note, he was only 16.
So he's a minor, which is an issue.
While others, if you think you're going to college, usually you're 18. So everyone else going through these experiments were 18. So I think there's a bit difference between a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old. It's important to note. Additionally, Ted didn't know what the experiment was. He thought he was signing up for debates, but he didn't really know his proctor had a script of humiliating him and saying these cruel things so that he could tear him down. And it suggested that the experiments likely would have affected him differently than the others. The general theory, though, is that the experiment didn't really make Ted want to be a killer, but they point out that schizophrenia is known to arise, like I said, in people after traumatic experiences, often in their late teens. So this is kind of the time period for that to come out. If the experiments had caused Ted's schizophrenia, it could explain why he was suddenly, disinterested in close friends. He was getting a bit more radical. Who knows? But also the trauma from the experiment might explain why he targeted a psychologist during his attacks, right? Later, Ted would be asked why he put up with the experiments for 3 years, and he said, quote, "I thought I could take it, and I wanted to prove I couldn't be broken."
Yeah, it's all very interesting.
Also a bit more ego there, right?
Yeah. But in January of 1998, John Zerzan called Ted and told him, quote, "Ted, I have something to tell you because I think you are the last person who doesn't know. Your lawyers pled insanity. It's an insanity defense, straight up." And Ted replied, "Why the lying bastards?" Ted attempted to tell the judge he wanted to defend himself. He didn't like the way his lawyers were handling the trial. The judge told him it was too late in the trial and he couldn't defend himself. He had to stick with the lawyers he had. And that night, Ted attempted suicide by hanging in prison, but he was ultimately rescued. Finally, Ted's lawyers agreed that Ted should take a plea deal. This allowed him to plead guilty to murder in exchange for life in prison. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. On January 22nd, 1998, many of his victims and the families of his victims came to make impact statements to Ted. Susan Moser, widow of Thomas Moser, said, quote, "Make this sentence as permanent for him as he has made ours, Tom's, and the others. His so-called causes are a smokescreen for his only objective, to kill anything that is alive." That's a powerful statement. Yeah, tend to agree with that as well. Afterward, he told John Zerzan that he didn't understand why they needed to say anything since he had been charged. He said people were crying and wailing and he didn't get why they were so upset.
Might be that low EQ, right?
Yep. He simply couldn't understand the emotions they were feeling or why making statements might bring them closure. That was the last time that John corresponded with Ted. Ted was then transferred to the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. There, he was a model prisoner, but spent his days in a room where he couldn't see nature. During his interview with Kintz, Ted said that he was worried he would forget his memories of the mountains and woods. Kintz asked if his lack of view of the outside world was going to drive him crazy, and Ted replied, quote, "No, it won't drive me crazy. I won't let them break my spirit." After Ted's conviction, Linda suggested that David reach out to some of the victims and apologize and tell them that no matter how hard he fought to save Ted from the death penalty, it was in no way meant to devalue their lives or suffering or the lives of those who were killed. During this, David called Gary Wright but only got his voicemail. He left an awkward message with a brief explanation of why he was calling. Later, when the two finally connected on the phone, Gary stopped David in the middle of his apology and said, quote, "Hey David, this isn't your burden to carry. It's going to get better, but you can't carry this one. If you ever need to talk, just feel free, 24/7. Call me." What a great guy Gary is after all that.
I know. I do love that that is a little bit of a shining light in this case where a lot of the victims and even with David kind of came together after all this.
Yeah, and years later, Gary and David are still incredibly close friends. But on June 10th, 2023, 81-year-old Ted Kaczynski was found unresponsive in his cell. He was transported to the medical center where he was pronounced dead. The FBI have not released an official cause of death, but a senior law enforcement officer confirmed it was suicide. This was also reported by the Associated Press and the New York Times. Ted was also in the late stages of cancer, and after his death, the New York Times also reached out to a few of his victims for comments. Strangely, many of his victims have said that they read Ted's manifesto in an attempt to understand why he attacked them. Many actually agreed with a lot of his points, but many believe that his heartless choice to use violence to be heard completely undercut his entire message. Which I think sums this all up perfectly.
Yeah, I agree.
Mostly they agree that his death has brought them a sense of closure, which I 100% understand too. Yeah, man.
Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah, it's a monster case. And I mean, God, you could dive into this for days. I mean, someone could do a whole podcast just on this case for 100 episodes probably.
Seriously.
Like there's so much, and then especially if you break down the manifesto and everything.
Yeah. I think my favorite part of this case, not to sound weird, but it's really the relationship of him and his brother. How David kind of at the end had to come to terms with that, because thinking of myself, you have a brother, I have a brother, you have a brother. Mm-hmm. I don't know, just thinking about that, like, holy shit. Known this guy my whole entire life, and he is one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history that is killing people in the most horrific ways. I don't know, coming to terms with that, and not only coming to terms with it, but being the one to turn him in essentially that's powerful stuff right there.
Yeah, and I think it speaks to David as a human being, that he was willing to, full well knowing that was going to sever his relationship with his brother forever.
Yeah.
But ultimately doing it for the greater good and, preventing others from being hurt or killed by Ted is a courageous act. Not everybody can do it. And I think the fact that he was willing to do it, and I think Linda gets a lot of credit as well
for sure,
for kind of encouraging him and pushing him in the right direction to come forward and dive into this and really evaluate whether or not, this was really his brother doing all this.
Isn't that kind of poetic too? Yeah. That it's his brother's wife, something that he would never
that brings
have.
Him down too.
Yeah. It's like something that Ted could never access and never really figured out in his life was relationships with not only others, but specifically with women, and how to date, how to be in a relationship. And the poetry that it was Linda that really urged David to bring him down, the wife.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I think he used all these other things as a smokescreen.
Yeah.
To kind of hide behind.
Yeah.
And the whole time it's just personal revenge. He's angry about how his life had turned out and the rejection that he experienced, and see that so many times with other serial killers out there.
when I was less informed about this case, I was more interested in the manifesto and what he had to say about that. I was like, he's raising some really good points. And now the more I know about Ted Kaczynski and these murders, I'm like, I don't care what you have to say. It is a smokescreen. It's disingenuous. I don't think, even if you really felt this way about society and the direction that we were going, I think you had no concrete answers to how we actually solve this, because just saying, oh, technology, we need to revert back to a pre-technological time period is the stupidest thing for such a smart guy.
Yeah.
That is such a stupid answer to an actual problem that we have. You're proposing nothing, really, at the end of the day. And I know Ted isn't going to hear this. He's dead. But I'm just saying, for anyone who's like remotely interested in his manifesto out there, it's bullshit, really. There's no answers. It's just a critique. It's just hatred baked into a long-winded bullshit 40-page essay is really what it is.
Yeah, when he had the full capability of going about this a totally different way, and he could have been a famous professor, a famous author. I mean, he could have followed all the other geniuses before him,
right,
and actually contributed to society and really left a mark on the world and a legacy that people would actually care to remember. And instead, I think he always had this dark side to him from very early on. As soon as he started experiencing rejection, and I mean, then couple that with the experiments he went through and everything else, I think something switched on. There's a quote, and I don't remember the exact quote, but maybe somebody out there can find it. He did say something, or in his early years, like in his teen years, he said something along the lines of, either it's okay as a genius to feel sadistic sometimes. He made a crazy, weird statement about being a genius and having sadistic thoughts.
Wow.
Yeah, if anybody can find the exact quote on that, I tried to look for it while we were recording here, and I couldn't find it.
So he was trying to normalize those,
but he was trying to normalize
problems early on.
He was trying to compute that in his head and somehow justify it. And so I think he really was a sadistic killer from early on, and it was a personal revenge thing for him. And then as he went along and, went through other experiences, it just kind of got twisted and weaved into this, persona that he created for himself. And, being isolated for that long, you're going to have to think about something. And maybe it was a good thing that he was like focusing on like, oh, how the technological world is ruining everything, rather than like obsessing about murdering people every day. Because had he done that, he would have just went out and murdered people like every other serial killer.
Yeah.
And there probably would have been far more victims had he done that. So it's kind of, this is it's such a weird one.
Yeah, it really is.
It's a very unique serial killer case.
A lot to dive into and digest. But I think my last note on it is the isolation thing out in the cabin, like you touched on. I think the problem with it was that if you think that's the way you live your life and recreate, if you feel like you've lost your autonomy and then you go out in the cabin to try and reconnect with nature and regain your autonomy, and you personally reject technology and you do that, good, go and do that. And if that fulfills you, great. I'm happy for you. But then to try and proselytize that idea to everybody else and inflict your pain on everybody else because of this thing, and you think that the world should be this way, I think really they say that the terrorism undermines his writings, which it absolutely does. But I also think there's just flaws. There's just fallacies in his own ideologies. He doesn't live what he preaches. It didn't work out for him. He didn't regain autonomy. He didn't really reconnect with nature in a positive way, right? Like none of these things worked out for him. So why should I believe anything that he says? I just got big gripe with Ted K out here.
Well, he's spending 20 years building technology.
Yeah, right.
Like, talk about a hypocrite, dude.
Yeah.
You're over here like literally building technology, which you could argue a bomb is a piece of technology.
Yeah.
I mean, look at bombs now. They are highly sophisticated pieces of technology.
Yeah.
So you literally were doing exactly what you were preaching against.
And using machinery
using
to build
machines
that technology.
and devices to murder people.
And he's like, oh, the motorcycles out of my... I was like, you were catching rides with your neighbors in the cars.
Right.
You were utilizing those cars as well. So totally
it was all a disguise for him to hide behind, and an ego thing for him.
Yeah.
Is like his ego was, so important to him and fragile.
Yeah.
That, as many serial killers are, they want, they start down this road and they're like, and especially if they get away with it for a while, they start getting this confidence of like, oh, I'm never going to be caught. I'm smarter than all these, all the law enforcement. And so I think, ultimately his ego led to his demise, because he's like, oh, well, I'm going to send my manifesto out there and they're going to print it, or I'm going to do more stuff. And it's like, was he not smart enough to think, like, what if my brother sees this, or what if somebody in my family sees it and turns me in?
Yeah.
Like, the fact that he missed that possibility, it just shows like
his ego blinded him. Yeah, it was his hubris. You're right. Yeah.
So not as smart as he really thinks he is.
Yeah.
And there was just such a different path he could have gone down, and he chose to let the rage inside of him consume him, and definitely left his mark on the world in the worst possible way. So that's Ted Kaczynski for you.
There it is. Yeah.
If you haven't seen the Unabomber in his own words on Netflix, definitely watch that. Really good series that you get to hear a lot. They have a lot of the tapes from Ted, and a lot of media that I don't think you can see anywhere else. That's pretty interesting to check out. But I think we're going to wrap it up there. My back is about to literally break in half from these damn chairs. This was a long one. Hopefully you stuck around to the end. If you did, we really appreciate it. We do work very hard on these episodes, and for all of you that stick around to the end, we salute you. And let us know your thoughts on Ted in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, make sure you subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. We'd really appreciate it. But we'll be back next week with a really good one for you. We've got a special episode coming for you next week. A little bit different than normal here at Lights Out, which we're excited about. But until then, lights out, everybody.